Okay, everybody ready? All right, I'll call to order the, what day is today? April 18th, City of Boulder Planning Board meeting. The first thing on our agenda is actually to modify the agenda. I want to ask that we do appointments for chair and vice chair at the beginning of this meeting because I have to recuse myself for the first agenda items. So I want to open it up to nominations for those spots.
You ready for a nomination? Are you ready for a nomination? Okay, I'd like to nominate Brian Bowen to be the chair of the planning board for the next year.
Thanks. Any other nominations? Okay. Other nominations, or should we call the question?
Call the vote.
Ayes?
Aye.
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 Nays?
Before we I cast my vote, I'd like to understand why it's appropriate to do this now rather than in our retreat, which is coming up in a week or two,
Sorry, I probably...
when I'm customarily aware that we do it.
Yeah, I mentioned that at the beginning of the meeting and also emailed the group about it before. I need to recuse myself from the next item on the agenda, and so we need someone else to run the meeting.
Thank you.
Oh, could I also point out, last year we actually did do the vote in a meeting.
Yeah, we've done that a number of times.
Could I also point out that I'd like to nominate Harmon Zuckerman as vice chair?
Well, let's give John a chance to see if he wants to vote or not.
No,
He voted.
I'll
Did you
vote in.
Okay. Great. That's unanimous. Thanks, everybody. Or no thanks, depending on how you look at it. Thanks for nothing. So then nominations for vice chair?
I'd like to nominate Harmon Zuckerman.
Great,
for
I'll
vice
second that.
chair.
Any other nominations? Okay. Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, any opposed? Nope. Okay, we have a new chair and vice chair. Let the bloodbath begin. So the first part of our agenda tonight is the approval of meeting minutes. We've got meeting minutes from March 21st and April 4th. I know some folks had offered suggestions to Cindy for corrections via email. Do we have any other suggestions for corrections tonight? Nope. Does anyone make a motion to approve those?
I'll make a motion, we approve the minutes.
I'll second.
Cool. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Nope. Okay, so the next item on our agenda is public participation. We've got two public hearing items tonight. One is the form-based code review for the affordable housing component of 30th and Pearl, the Pollard project. And the other is recommendations on the utility components of the design and construction standards. If anyone wants to speak to the planning board on items that are not either of those things, this is the time to do it. Cindy, do we have anybody? Okay, cool. And then we have no dispositions or call-ups or continuations to talk about. So that will take us to the item 5A on the agenda, which is the form-based code review of 30th and Pearl. And because I have a conflict on this project, I'm going to recuse myself and hand it over to Harmon Zuckerman, our new chair, or vice chair. Acting chair.
For a moment.
Yep. Enjoy the life in the spotlight.
Thanks. I'll leave you your seat and chair the meeting from here.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Great. Thanks very much. Good evening, Vice Chair, members of the board. I'm going to turn it over to Elaine McLaughlin, who has served as the case manager on this project, to present the staff analysis.
Great. Thank you, Charles. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Make sure we're on mic here. Thanks. So for this evening, just a quick overview of where we're headed. We're going to look at the planning context, both the broad context and also why we're here this evening. And then we'll take a look at how the context has built out over time. A brief summary of the proposed project, and a lot of our discussion of the project will be in the key issues. So consistency with the form-based code and if the exceptions meet the standards under the form-based code. But not to make anybody focus tightly, but just as an example, and to understand why we're here today, it's important to note that it's generally a staff level review, and it's essentially a checklist, and that's just an excerpt from your checklist in attachment A as to whether something meets the standard or does not meet it. It's a prescriptive process. However, the code does provide, as you can see here, an opportunity for staff to refer the decision to Planning Board. And in this case, given that it's a city-owned property, we determined that it would be appropriate to refer to the Planning Board. So moving out into a broad process perspective, most of us know that the city's been planned for decades with managed growth through our comprehensive plan that gets updated every 5 years, but there's some consistency in our comp plan over time. And that identifies elements that define the city's structure, and in particular, there's centers around which the city is identified as areas that have potential for infill and redevelopment. And most of these centers are anticipated with a higher intensity compared to the established residential areas that are in Boulder. And among those areas is Boulder Junction. And the comp plan policies actually further identify where mixed use and higher density development should be concentrated, and in particular, in relevancy to this case, its proximity to transit centers. For the benefit of those who weren't part of the Transit Village process, it was adopted in 2007, and the intent was really to establish a regional transit facility somewhere near the Boulder Valley Regional Center, around which a transit-oriented development could transform what at the time was, and sort of still remains, a underutilized industrial area, really to be built out at a higher intensity with mixed use and make an urban neighborhood. Build out is intended in 2 phases. Phase 1 is essentially west of the railroad tracks, as you can see in the exhibit. There's a little bit of phase 2 across 30th Street, but phase 2 mostly occurs east of the railroad tracks. Also envisioned in TVAP is to infill the broad super blocks with walkable high-density neighborhoods, and those are intended to be connected to the transit. Ultimately, the intent is to provide approximately 1,400 to 2,400 new residential units, and today with this project, we're probably at about 1,200. As part of TVAP, there was a land use plan that was adopted, and as you can see for the MU2, land use designations where this particular project site's located. It's intended for the vision of TVAP is 3- and 4-story mixed-use buildings, so really pretty high-density, fairly large buildings in this context, as has essentially been built out over time. The adopted TVAP mixed-use 2 then translated to mixed-use business as part of the comprehensive plan, and then it's defined as areas that are essentially in various areas, but primarily for this around 30th and Pearl Street, with business or residential uses. And in particular, it's important to note that it calls out housing and public uses supporting housing will be encouraged and may even be required. So those adopted land uses then translated to a comprehensive rezoning over time that became the MU4, and that's defined as mixed-use residential areas generally intended for residential uses with neighborhoods serving retail and office. It's anticipated that development will occur in a pedestrian-oriented pattern with buildings built up to the street. So again, really an urban configuration is anticipated. Then over time, to help ensure a certain predictable outcome for design and development, the city went a step further and developed the form-based code for Boulder Junction. It was adopted in 2016, and it was after a year of workshops and planning facilitated discussions. It's really intended to be prescriptive. It's does it meet it or does it not meet it? And if not, does the exception meet the criteria that you can review against? It looks at function and the form and the design character of the buildings, as well as anticipating a certain quality with the types of materials that are expected. So let's pull out a little bit and look at the broad perspective. The area that is in gold is what had been owned by the city over time. It's an 11-acre area that was purchased in the early 2000s. It was part of a site selection for a transit facility, and through a design-build RFP, it resulted in a below-grade bus facility, regional bus facility with a hotel, the reuse of the historic depot, 21 permanently affordable units that wrapped a shared parking structure. And then when we zoom in a bit more, you can see that the built context with that RTD bus facility, the historic depot that's now a restaurant, the hotel, there's apartments, office nearby. 29th Street retail and those that are associated with Whole Foods like Barnes & Noble, there's the Mapleton ball fields nearby, as well as some service commercial uses and other types of build-out, mixed-use build-out, as well as the Goose Creek Path. You can see there's actually an astonishing array of uses that really in a horizontal mix for this walkable context of this site. So overlaid onto the site in this initial phase of redevelopment is a city-owned property in what's referred to as 4 different quadrants. Quadrants 2 and 4 south is what we're looking at today. The plans are forthcoming for that quadrant 1, quadrant 3, and then that 4 north. So those are blanked out in this plan. But when we look at the plans for the proposed project, the buildings are referred to 2A, 2B, and 4B, and they're planned to be redeveloped by the Boulder Housing Partners, essentially as permanently affordable rentals for 30 to 60% area median income. In addition, the applicant is building below grade parking. There's 2 new roadways planned, A and B, extension of a multi-use path through the site from Pearl Street on the bottom of the screen up towards Goose Creek, along with 2 internal Paseo connections. So we'll spend a little bit more time looking at the project with this first key issue and consistency with the form-based code. So beginning with the functional aspects of the site, the regulating plan identifies required functional aspects. And in this case, the buildings are intended to be a general building type, and that's defined as essentially a basic building that serves the urban fabric and built along a sidewalk, again, reinforcing that pedestrian street face. However, it's also required that there be storefront on that Form 4B part of the site. There's also criteria for maximum heights, and this is intended to maintain a certain view shed. It mostly impacts that 4B building. That's kept at 3 stories. We'll go over that a little bit further. There's also a requirement for a street terminus at that new Street B. And then there's also an intent to do the Street A, along with the Goose Creek, which is considered a type A frontage for a waterway. There's also the need for a type B Paseo, type B street, of course, which we've talked about, Paseo requirements, and then also that new multi-use path. So when we compare that to the site plan, you can see that a lot of those functions have actually been established pretty clearly in this particular regulatory plan. When we take a look at building, 2A, it's located along 30th Street and that new street type frontage of A. It's designed as a 3- and 4-story building that utilizes brick in various layout patterns, red and warm gray. There's some material sample boards here. And it essentially demonstrates that it meets the form-based code requirements for a whole host of these requirements: streetscape, Paseo width and lighting. Most of these are just derived from the checklist, and where there's any variation or request for exception, we'll talk about that. So then building 2B is located next to it and adjacent to the Goose Creek Path, which is actually set a little bit lower. We have some images of that. And 30th Street, and it utilizes some warm and dark gray brick in stacked and running bod contemporary patterns with horizontal wood, all of which meet those major and minor material requirements of the form-based code. And then 2B was also found to meet a number of the form-based code provisions. And again, pretty much all of the buildings to get to this point have met most of those criteria, but we'll talk about some exceptions. And then, of course, 4B at the corner of Junction Place and Pearl Parkway is designed as a 3-story building. It has really warm or light gray stacked bond brick, vertical metal panel, and some wood composite. And because there's a requirement for that store frontage, there's black aluminum storefront with steel trim details, things like metal awnings and such. Building 4B meets the majority of the general building and store frontage requirements. And again, there's some exceptions that we'll talk about next. And then there's that street terminus requirement at the end of Street B. The applicants actually creatively come up with an awning that's essentially an architectonic element, contemporary manner with high tension steel cables and a public art opportunity. And they could talk a little bit more about that as well. So for key issue 2, the question is if the board finds the exceptions meet the criteria of the code. And there's specifically exceptions can be granted if it's consistent in this A exception with TVAP and it won't create adverse impacts. And B, if there's site conditions that really weren't created by the applicant that makes compliance impractical. And if an alternative is the minimum that provides relief. So with the first exception, it's the Paseo treatment. And for wide Paseo, as this is, the requirement's actually for scored concrete. But in this case, the applicant's providing permeable pavers. And TVAP goals suggest that we create a cohesive appearance for a pedestrian space. So it meets that as well as other form-based code criteria for greater pervious surface on the site. And in addition, staff finds the exception wouldn't create an adverse impact on the surroundings any more than the gray concrete would. That one's pretty straightforward. This exception with regard to the maximum impervious coverage relates a little bit to that previous one. And while the requirement for the form-based code's a maximum 65% impervious surface, between the 3 buildings, it averages about 76%. But staff finds that exception meets the criteria as really the intent is to create a new urban neighborhood with diversity housing and managed parking. And there's some challenges to making pervious surface and meeting those goals when you have below grade parking that takes that parking function and moves it down below. It also helps with grading and storm drainage, and staff finds that it really doesn't create any additional impacts than if the pervious surface was met. There's some creative ways that landscaping is done with an 18-inch depth of soil put on the parking structure, but again, that doesn't fall under the pervious surface requirement. Then there's an exception to the north and west sides of 2B, and that is related to the Build 2 zone and the Build 2 corner. And in this particular case, because it's a type A frontage, both along 30th and along Goose Creek, it's a bit challenged because of the regional Piesco easement. It's essentially Excel overhead easement. It's enormous. You can't miss it when you're out there. And the easement also jogs to the south, as you can see in the image up above, and overlaps onto the west side of the Build 2. Since the building can encroach into that easement, compliance really isn't possible. And so staff finds that the site design actually does achieve a building forward design, and that was the intent of the Build 2 without the letter of that particular rule. In addition, it doesn't create any greater impacts in this particular case, again, because you can note that Goose Creek Path is really set down below. This relates a little bit to an exception also for the transformer location. This is really a 4-sided building, and you have either type A or type B frontages required on all 4 sides, and you have that below grade parking on the south end of the building. So really the only place to put this is on the north end, and you can see it highlighted in turquoise, and this is the transformer. In this particular case, staff finds that the solution still meets the TVAP guidelines in that it provides a pretty interesting streetscape. The applicant has also talked about perhaps doing some sort of artistic wall installation on the area where there's a blank wall adjacent to the transformers. So that's something they can talk a little bit about as well. That also then relates to transparency for this particular building, and you can see that that transformer is that where it's located precludes from having any type of openings because of the Piesco line that's there. However, again, TVAP suggests pedestrian scale materials and architectural articulation can be transparent windows and defined entrances. And like I say, the applicants talked about maybe treating that wall with an art installation, public art installation. So then moving on to building 4B and the store frontage transparency and exceptions required for the ground floor storefront transparency on the east elevation of building 4B. A portion of that required 60 feet of store frontage windows on the ground floor is intended as affordable residential units. So instead of storefront, however, staff recommends that this exception meet the criteria because TVAP goals suggest that land that the city owns in the southeast corner area of Boulder Junction will be developed with a higher percentage of affordable housing. So in this case, it meets TVAP. And again, because the storefront wraps around to the east of certain portion, and in that area where the actual use is retail, the building's fenestration really does reflect the use that's planned. So staff finds that it meets that criteria. And then finally, there's an exception request for the ground floor of 4B on the south side, and it's essentially a greater overhang than the form-based code would suggest for storefront. It suggests 18 inches. In this case, it's about 6 feet. And essentially what's going on is the applicant's providing greater living space on the second floor in this location. So again, deferring to that TVAP goal of having a higher percentage of affordable housing, having that extend a little bit further actually helps to address that goal of additional residential. You could also figure that in this particular location, south-facing location, that those broad, overhang will help shade the sun in the summer and provide solar gain in the winter, and it still is an attractive streetscape. A word about public notification. The sign's been posted on the site. We provided written notification. News from City Hall also posted information about it. This says no public comments were received. That's erroneous. There were some public comments received, 3 public comments. 2 of them did indicate support for it, and a third had some concerns about some TVAP connections. So with that, staff recommends that Planning Board approve form-based code review, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Do any members of Planning Board have questions? John?
Yeah, I'd like to inquire about the approval of the variance for the east, not the variance, but the
Exception.
the special arrangements for the east side of building 4B, and I'll be asking the applicant too. I'm worried there, and I'm interested in staff's thoughts about that the alignment along to the east will be pretty dead. And the reason I'm concerned about that is that I see there's no doors going in to the residences in that area. And so I fear that along that entire length, people will pull their curtains shut and it'll be quite dead and effectively the back of the building. And it's not clear to me that that is what we want along that road. So I'm interested in staff's attitude about that.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up having doorways there. Initially, the applicant did illustrate doorways in that location, and while that's not a requirement for the transparency, it's really about having a certain amount of window, window glazing. Staff felt like it would be acceptable to have units that didn't have direct access. And in this particular case, the units that are planned are oriented toward adults with developmental disabilities, and in this particular location. And it seemed like it would be a more acceptable approach to have that broader opening, but not necessarily have entry and access directly onto the street. And you can talk with the applicant a little bit more.
There was some concern on behalf of the applicant, the population that would be living there. I think that they can probably go through their rationale. The other thing that I would note is that those openings are designed to actually be retrofitted into doorways in the event that the special population that it would be residing there now changes over time. So there was some thought given to if in the future it was appropriate to put doors in there, that would be something that we'd be able to accomplish easily.
Thank you.
Sarah?
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, just another question, then I'll also be seeking guidance from the applicant on this too. And that is that I noticed that there's really no balconies associated with any of these accommodations. And I understand that there may be cost and design considerations associated with that, but considering what an important amenity that is for many folks, I was wondering what staff's thoughts are on that.
So that's actually not a requirement of the form-based code. So
I understand it's not a requirement in the code, but nevertheless, your thoughts on that?
well, it's an amenity-rich area, and in a context like this, an urban context, the expectation is there's the Mapleton Ball Fields, there's a small pocket park that's just north of this site. There's the Goose Creek Trail. There's a number of open space amenities that would allow for folks to enjoy. In this particular building, there's an interior open space area that's pretty well designed, and the applicant can talk about that as well. But again, when you're looking at it strictly from form-based code, and we're checking boxes, that's not one of the boxes to check.
Thank you.
So I actually have a bunch of questions that have to do with traffic patterns on A and B, and the Paseo and the multi-use trail. And I think this is the time to ask, could you first just walk us through what the traffic patterns are on Street A and Street B?
Sure. So let me get to both the regulating plan and the site plan. So it really essentially what it does is it helps to reestablish the grid pattern. And so that would be sort of the key reason for doing Street A and Street B. In this particular case, Street B comes off of the multi-way boulevard that's Pearl Parkway today. And so access into the site would be through a slip ramp that comes in on the multi-way boulevard and goes down Street B, terminates at Street A. So at that point, you can either go east or west. In terms of the multi-use path, a similar intent is to use the slip ramp. The multi-way boulevard really is intended as a shared street. It's where the car is really essentially a guest. And so pedestrians and bikes mingle with the car. So same thing, bike comes on multi-way boulevard, it goes on the multi-use path, and then can connect up to the north.
Are both streets two-way?
Yes.
Two-way streets? Mm-hmm. So both streets are both entrance and exits onto both Pearl Parkway and 30th Street?
Correct. Mm-hmm. And Junction Place.
Okay, so I don't, is now the time for me to share some concerns, or do I do that after?
Let's do that after.
Okay.
If you have questions that have to do with staff's review,
Okay.
this is the time to ask them.
Okay. Then the other thing I'd like to understand is the other buildings that will be built in phase 2 are all residential?
We don't know that yet. That actually hasn't been provided to us yet. Members of the applicant team maybe could address that.
Okay. And then I do have, this is about the review, which is about the choice of color, the use of colors. I went down to check out the site. I'm actually down there a lot because my gym is around there. Mm-hmm. And the use of white on existing buildings in that neighborhood, I think is not successful. So I'm curious, what are the, is there any openness for discussion of perhaps changing some of the color options. So that's a more,
Of the proposed buildings, so there's examples, there's material samples here, and I think one of the ones you're probably talking about is the hotel, which is actually a white concrete building. In this particular case, the applicant's using more of a warm gray for most of the brick, or sort of a blonde brick, I guess you could say. You can ask them about that, but form-based code also doesn't regulate color, so that's something that we don't have a means to regulate.
Yeah, and most development regulations don't regulate color.
but we do have expectations that they will, I don't have the language right in front of me, but that it's human scaled and design and color are a component
Sure.
of the form-based code. Okay, so thank you.
Anybody else on planning board have any questions for staff? Okay. Go ahead.
Hi. So one question I had to do with the breakdown of the residences themselves. Is there a target breakdown in terms of low income versus medium income in terms of the number of, apartments that are?
So I'm going to defer that to the applicant because I think they could speak very clearly on that.
All right.
Excuse me. The impervious exception, I was just curious because the site actually includes the other phases, but that calculation was done just from in the phase 1 areas. So I guess that means that the phase 2 sections will be completed separately.
That's right, and it really is on a building site or lot that's measured, so not necessarily throughout the entire site.
Oh, I see. So not a
It's
full.
lot by lot.
Ah, okay. That was the explanation I was needing.
So
And-
another,
go
I was
ahead.
just going to follow through. So in other words, the criterion that we're familiar with around site review, where all of the lots that are owned in contiguous, that contiguous lots are owned by the same owner have to meet all the site review criteria. It doesn't apply in form-based code review, is what you're saying. Okay, good.
And my understanding is that the underground parking will go under 2A and 2B, but also in, let me look at my cheat sheet here, quadrant 3 buildings.
Does overlap into quadrant 3, that's right.
So we're kind of overlapping a little bit into that later phase. And the later phase is expected to come soon, or?
Yeah, we're
that's-
expecting that in the next few tracks.
That's what I was wondering, okay.
So that's why it'd be good to defer to the applicant on questions about that subsequent development.
Yeah, I just wanted to get a feel. Thank you.
Any other questions, John?
Yeah, can you explain to us what sort of instructions were given to the applicant regarding the location of the entry to the underground parking?
Well, there was a desire to not have it too close to 30th due to stacking or to Junction Place, so it really needed to be central. And so essentially that terminates right at Street B. So it had two competing desires, I guess you could say. One of having an access that wouldn't cause trauma on 30th and Junction Place, and another to do something interesting there. And so the applicant has come up with a pretty clever design to address that terminus requirement.
So not to debate the pros and cons of that location, but one thing I'm just wondering about is the degree to which that location causes additional traffic to be going through to streets A and B that might otherwise be avoided. Was that a factor in the considerations?
Well, I don't think so. I think the intent is you have through streets and they're connected. So the interconnectivity assumes that you're going to handle a certain amount of traffic. And if there's more detailed questions, our engineering review manager's available to answer that, if you'd like him to come up and talk about it.
Okay, I'll harass them later.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Nobody else?
Oh, I did have, I'm sorry. Yeah, one more question I had was that I just wanted to confirm that transformer is actually able to go into the utility easement. So that location is in the Excel easement? Is that correct? That's what it looked like to me.
I believe that's correct, but I would defer again to either engineering.
We'll do that.
The applicant. Yeah, that's a good question.
Thank you.
Playing ping pong, John?
Yeah, just a real short one. To what degree are rooftop terraces encouraged or discouraged with this arrangement that we're working?
Well, again, it is not a requirement, but of course, it can contribute to open space, and TVAP suggests that we have different opportunities for open space.
And I would add, John, it's certainly possible the railing heights would need to be below the max height for the district. So that's tends to be an issue when you're considering rooftop patios.
Right, but I mean, for example, in the portions of the building that are not 4 stories, there might be some potential.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, seeing no more discussion or questions, actually, from planning board right now, I think we turn to the applicant portion, the applicant presentation portion. So if the applicant would come up, please.
Hi, good evening. My name is Jeremy Durham. I'm with Boulder Housing Partners. I'm told that formally I'm supposed to ask for 15 minutes of presentation.
Yeah.
That acceptable to, okay, great, thank you.
We give 10 minutes generally, but the
Yeah.
chair has the authority to extend that if he wants, and I will do that. You need 15 minutes?
That would be great, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, Jeremy Durham with Boulder Housing Partners. For those of you that don't know me, I think I know almost all of you from some context, and the rest I'm sure I'll get to know at some point. We've heard some great questions, and we're here and ready to answer them. So that's what tonight is about. We have our team here to help answer those. First, I'd like to just quickly create a little bit of context for what this project means to BHP as an organization and to our partnership with the city to provide affordable housing and make Boulder as inclusive as possible. So our journey with this site really began in earnest last fall when we were approached about trying to take the project over and move it forward with some pretty aggressive goals of breaking ground this year, which would allow us to preserve around $4.2 million of federal resources that are available for this site to allow us to achieve really deep affordability at the site. And that's one of the reasons why you're seeing just the affordable portion come forward today, because we're moving forward in an effort to meet that time frame. So I'm excited to report that based on the really collaborative and hard work of our team and the way they've worked with the city staff has been excellent, we are on track for that. And so we're here now, as we said, to bring you up to speed and answer your questions. Not only are we on track to meet some of the initial goals, but I think we're really excited to say that we've really actually, I think, improved the project in a lot of ways from some of the ways it was initially contemplated, and to the point where actually considering both the scale and depth of affordability that would be offered through this phase of the project, this project will do more to reduce rent burden for families and individuals in Boulder than any project in Boulder's history, pulling a full $1.2 million annually out of rent burden. So that's just considering what market rate units are compared to the rents that we're able to charge. Not only that, but we're able to serve 2 special populations that really need housing in this community. One of them is a permanently supportive housing population, so formerly homeless individuals wrapped around with case management services, as well as the intellectually and developmentally disabled community through our partnership with Ramble that will have a really great program here, as well as housing for some of those populations. So not only are we excited about the populations that we're able to house, the depth of affordability and the scale of the project that we're able to bring to meeting Boulder's affordable housing challenges, but we really feel that this is the ideal location to do it, in that this is a location that is just an incredible redevelopment opportunity, an opportunity to take what was once a car dealership and is now a blighted parking lot and make it into something really beautiful that really serves the community. And that's something that we've heard is an area of real common ground in the community. I think that across the spectrum, folks in Boulder want to see that happening. And so we're really proud to be, as the city's housing authority, and really as your housing authority here, presenting that opportunity tonight. And it's a site that is transit-oriented, which is obviously going to be great, not only for some of the special populations that we talked about, but for the workforce, which is really who we house. 75% of our working families work in the city of Boulder. So when we house them in Boulder, we help take cars off the road, which is good for everybody. So with that, I will turn it over to Laura Scheinbaum, who is our Director of Real Estate and has worked really hard on this. And obviously, we'll be here to answer your questions. So thanks.
Hi, good evening. I'm Laura Scheinbaum with Boulder Housing Partners, Real Estate Development Director. Really honored to be here tonight. Before I get started on my comments, and I'm not going to talk a whole lot because Bill's got a lot of things to say over here with Coburn, and Elaine provided a lot of context that I was going to cover, so I think I'm just going to highlight a few things. But first and foremost, I did want to say thank you to staff, both the housing division staff and the planning staff. They've been a tremendous asset and worked in collaboration with us to move something forward that's complex, a great benefit to the city, and really been done with great collaboration. So thank you all for your help as we move this forward in a very expedited fashion. So as you've heard, it's 5.6 acres. We're bringing forward to you 2 parcels of that tonight, 120 units. You asked about the affordability and the unit mix, so 120 units of forever affordable units. So in perpetuity, we will own and manage them as Boulder Housing Partners. In terms of the mix, we have not just at 60% AMI, we're really delving deep into those lower AMI units. So 30% of AMI is about 25% of the 120 units. We've got 40% AMI, about 7%, 50% at 23%, and then 60% AMI units at 46%. So really trying to again, get that rainbow effect of reaching a large range of folks here. And then we also have a range of unit configurations, so 0 to 3-bedroom, that really matches what it is we see in demand coming forward for the organization. So this is a great place where we can showcase and meet demand that we're seeing for the organization. Scale, really important here. Jeremy touched on that. What a perfect location. We have all of the transit corridors, regional bike paths, multimodal. So that's really, again, in terms of the density that we're seeing here, this is sort of the greatest location probably in town to do that at. We've dispersed the units at the site. So if you look at our entire portfolio, we are big believers in making sure that we are representing affordable product everywhere in the city. And this site, as a micro level of that, is no different. So what you see is the having affordable in northeast or northwest and southeast corners. We thought that was important, so we didn't have any kind of line of demarcation about having affordable in one and market rate in the other. Jeremy touched on the special needs populations. Again, we're excited to continue our partnership with the shelter and also really excited to start a new partnership with Ramble On. The commercial space that you see there will be affordable commercial. I want to make sure that that's really clear. We'll work with Ramble On with an expansion of their current location, which is on Pearl Street. It'll do vocational training for residents that live in that building with us and train them in the retail industry, which will be, again, a tremendous asset. So a win on that corner for both meeting form-based code and meeting a use is really needed for the population that will be living there. You'll hear it in a little bit from our public art consultant, but we have identified 4 public artists, or 4 artists to provide public art at the site. They've been identified, and we're working on contracts with them right now. Really exciting, large installations, and it's a passion of our organization. It will really add a lot of vibrancy to the facilities. Sustainability, 20% of BHP's electricity generated comes from solar. This will be an opportunity to just increase that amount. So we'll have solar on the roofs and obviously meet the energy code for the city, which is a high bar to begin with. And then finally, I want to call out that we'll be doing sort of a branding exercise for the entire site, so not just the parcels that we own, but we want there to be cohesion for the properties, so it might be a different name down the road. We're going to look for visual identity that can go throughout all of the different parcels that you see up there. So stay tuned for that, but we're really excited to bring forth a lot of these amenities to the property. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill Hollicky, and he'll basically.
Bill Hollicky with Coburn Architecture. Elaine's presentation was very comprehensive, so I'll just try to add color. As Elaine mentioned, the form-based code came out of 15 years of public outreach. First, there was community charrettes after the purchase, then there was the GVAP area plan, then there was the form-based code. So as the architect for BHP in the city, we did not feel it was our job to reconsider what the community desired. We felt it was our job to take what the community desired and try to bring it to life and make it an excellent place. So to that end, you can see that we really didn't change any of the initial form-based code framework plan. We tried to take it and make it into a great place. So to that point, the major requirements of the form-based code, there's 466 requirements in the form-based code. We counted today. Thought that was interesting. The big ones, street locations, paseos, the building heights, step downs, roof articulation, building length, there are no exceptions required or requested for any of that. We're trying to obey the community will here wherever possible, which is almost everywhere. When you get down to the details, form-based code is very specific, and it's fun to work with in a lot of ways. So materials, the types of materials, where the transparency is, how much of it there is, how the roof ends, where the window articulation is, expression lines, all that stuff is all followed. So Elaine highlighted a few exceptions, maybe 8, I think, in groups, in 3 main groups. Out of 466 things, that's what we need to talk to you about. The other thing to keep in mind is that the form-based code is a pilot, and the consultant wrote nearly 500 requirements, and almost all of them work great. There's a couple of discrepancies in the form-based code that result in some of these exceptions. We'll talk about that. I will try to hit some of the questions as I go through this, just to keep this efficient. Generally, and I'm trying to figure out a really polite way to say this, we share the concern that was raised on some of the surrounding colors. And that's as far as I'm going to go into that. But we are very concerned with the stark contrast in some locations. So there are no whites proposed here. We have tones, and the majority of the project has pretty saturated tones on purpose. The building across from the hotel we'll talk about, but there's a reason we selected that color. We're trying to not create this really jarring black and white effect. Roof decks and balconies, great question. So BHP tends to shy away from balconies for operational reasons, but we still want outdoor space, public space. So on this rendering, the upper floors, you can see the kind of step downs for the 3rd floors. Both of those are roof decks. We can get to them because we have the 4th floor that's higher, so we can come out without the challenges that Charles described, but we do have that outdoor space. Additionally, I'm going to flip around a little bit because I'm answering questions. I apologize. We have these interior courtyards on both 4 South and 2A, and those are designed by Civitas, the landscape architect, to be gathering spaces. So there's a child's play kind of, not a structure, but like just a landscape feature in the north one, and there's places for people to hang out in the south one. So we're trying to create these spots for people to congregate. Additionally, we're now in for tech doc on the project. We're trying to move this forward in order to maintain the qualified census tract. We've continued to refine because we're creating CDs. We also identified an area that we could have a little bit of outdoor space on this building as well. So you don't have a 4th floor here, so you can't come out. But we do have this 2nd floor balcony right at this corner, trying to, again, create the form-based code acknowledged important corner and make it a place that people can gather. So this building in particular is pretty important because as you come down Pearl Street and you take that slight left bend, it's right in front of you. It's like an access terminus. So that's why the form-based code is written with that little storefront requirement on the corner. So we felt, and we worked heavily with staff to create this sort of moment that comes up in the corner that acknowledges that that's a more commercial space. And that works really well with the Ramelon Pearl group because they're doing that sort of live-work scenario where there's this job training. So it's a really unique and pretty special circumstance that we get to have that kind of affordable commercial here. And then this is the backside of that building. And this is another point that there are no backsides to these buildings, right? They're all four-sided, which creates some of the exceptions in form-based code. But this is just a little bit of a rendering of that north-south street.
I'm sorry, that's the wall, the street, the side that's on Junction Place?
The west side of that new north-south street. So it's on the
West side.
Yeah, the
So
west side of the building.
It's on the B Street.
Exactly. Yep. So parking, really quickly to touch on this, because it's pretty important in the district. The parking is built under all of Q2 and Q3. The right-hand side of the parking will be devoted to the market rate. The left-hand side to the affordable. All of it follows the sum principles. So if you choose not to have a parking space, in BHP's world, you will pay less rent. In the affordable, in the market rate world, you can buy a unit. If you want a parking, you have to buy that separately. You don't get to just have it. Also, it's not a parking space. It's a right to use the parking pool. So that allows BHP to have fewer parking spaces because they can pool them. There's also spaces for visitors. On the market rate side, if the spaces aren't utilized, say in the middle of the day, they are required to be able and available to be used by the district. So anybody can park there. And there's a parking program I can go into technically how that works. But it's a pretty unique and progressive parking solution. The location, John, great question about why the location is here. So we went through this with traffic, both our consultant and city traffic folks, and it became pretty clear that the way to do this intersection was to have a normal cross intersection with the garage terminus on the north side of that intersection. Again, the concern, as Elaine and Charles mentioned, was having that too close to Junction Place or 30th was going to cause traffic queuing problems. People wouldn't be able to turn. So when that happened, it became a problem or opportunity, depending on how you look at it. So it's in a good location for traffic flow. So now how do we make it not look like the entrance to a parking garage? So this also brings up the art program that Laura was talking about. My apologies. We were working with Leah Clark, who will talk about it in more detail. We have 4 locations in the first phase. We'll have more in the second phase. We've opened that up to an RFP process for local artists. We had like 40 respondents to each location, so it was pretty good. We were able to choose from some really high-level submittals. It's preliminary, but right now, for example, the preliminary thought is there's 2 art installations on this one thing. There's a metal screening on the left that's designed, and then there's a mural on the support wall.
How much time do you need?
Just a minute. I'll get through it real quick. So those are the art locations. The last one, the upper one you saw, that's I'll skip that. On the bottom, you see through the storefront to a mural wall inside the building. So the exceptions is the last thing I'll talk about, and I'll do it quickly. Really, this is coming out of some discrepancies within the form-based code. For example, there was always an assumption that we would have parking garages here, but nobody really knew what the right impervious amount was. Due to a technical way that you define impervious surface, anything on top of a parking garage cannot count as impervious surface. So we can't get to that number. So we're doing everything we can. We're putting soil on top, we're planting things on top of the garage, but it still doesn't qualify as impervious surface. The Paseo, we switched from concrete to permeable pavers because it's better, but that requires another exception to get there. So it's this weird little cycle. And again, they got almost everything right. This is one, when we go to, if we ever go to a full form-based code, we would recommend a little change to this impervious number if we want subsurface garages. Another one was, there's an assumption that we're going to have alleys everywhere. So there's a requirement that transformers go into alleys. Some of the form-based code area does have alleys. This one doesn't. We have 4 side fronts. So we need an exception to deal with the transformers. So we had that PSCO easement. David, this was your question. We put the transformer up there. It's a little extra easement that covers it, but it's not over a garage. It's inside an easement. We don't have those problems we've seen on other projects. It does create a blank wall in the building, but that's where we put the art wall, because we're trying to turn that blank wall exception into an art opportunity. So I'll stop there and say I can talk more about any one of these exceptions for questions, and just say that you know, for us after 15 years, it's pretty cool to see this actually come to life. It's really exciting. 120 affordable units. So thank you. Sorry about the extra time.
Thank you, Bill. Okay. Imagine we're going to have some questions for the applicant. Peter, you had your hand up first.
Sure. I understand the parking, the location of the parking garage exit and entrance where it needs to be, and I'm sure you tried it a million ways. It really seems like a loss that the heart of the project is instead this orifice that's swallowing and secreting automobiles, when really it should be the center and the heart of the project.
Excellent use of the word orifice. Really, really well done.
A subterranean creature.
Yeah, you know, what's interesting about it, one thing to keep in mind is that it's not just cars. There's, how many bike parking spaces do we have in the garage? 200 or
Don't
300?
blame the bikes.
No, here's what I'm saying, not blaming the bikes. What I'm saying is that
Not worried about the bikes.
that's a pretty, we talk a lot about transportation, modal transportation. That vertical circulation is a big deal. That's where you park your car, that's where you come to your unit, that's where you park your bike. There's 300 bike parking spaces down there. People get in and out of the building there. So that thing, I agree, it's still not maybe the ideal part, but that is where people circulate up and down. So having that be something special and not a leftover, forgotten back alley part, that was what we felt was the opportunity.
Why not make it more part of the market rate developers' problem to solve as they come along in this and put some more onus on them on the underground parking costs and where this goes, and let them get creative to work around it and hide it a bit more?
Great segue. So we're submitting the market rate portion on May 6th, so that's just a couple weeks. There isn't a developer. The city will be bringing that in front of you separately, so it is on the market rate side of the project. It does take away from their developable area. It doesn't take away from the BHP units, so it's put there on purpose, just as you described.
Yeah.
But no market rate person gets to say anything about it because it's going to be part of the approval that they buy.
Oh, I know. They'll work around it wherever you put it.
Correct, yes.
So
Yeah.
I don't know how to solve the problem of alleviating the cars immediately ejecting out of the parking garage into where people are walking, because people do come out of those garages without the total awareness of the sidewalk.
I think I should defer, we have site triangles to protect that, but I should defer to city staff, I think, to explain that, I'm not a traffic engineer. I should let them explain why it's best in that location, why it's safest in that location.
Okay. Thank you. I'm done with that.
Okay.
So I actually want to follow up, not so on traffic, not so much specifically on the location of the parking garage. So it sounds like you and the traffic engineers have been talking quite a bit about the challenges of, I think you used a term of traffic backup or something with regards to both Pearl and 30th Street. And it strikes me that there's a real challenge with B Street emptying out into Pearl when it's literally about 25 yards from Junction Place, where there's a light.
Yep.
And the same with Street A being both an entrance and an exit onto 30th Street. I'm very happy that the design of the whole space is taking down the super block down to something smaller. But I think the impact of having a two-way street feeding into 30th Street actually sort of negates the value of that when it comes to traffic patterns. That 30th Street's super busy, as you know, and what we are adding here is another street that feeds onto 30th Street. We'll have 30th on one side, we have Mapleton on another, we have a parking lot just above Goose Creek, and then all the way up to, this happens to be an area I know well, all the way up to Valmont. There are multiple streets all feeding into 30th Street. So I'm wondering if there's any way to think about making both Street A and Street B one-way streets into the development and then feeding out into Junction Place so that cars are actually at a stoplight and can enter onto Pearl Street more easily. I realize that's a big suggestion, and I'm just sort of curious what your thoughts are on that.
Lots of points in there. Let me clarify a couple things, and then I don't know, would you prefer to speak to this rather than me? Oh, great. And we have Chris. I'll definitely call Chris up. So one clarification. Street B, as it heads south on the Pearl Street, is hitting that little multi-use path. It's not multi-use street. It's not going directly out onto Pearl Street. So you can't drive, unless you're a fire truck, that's the only thing that's allowed. You can't drive south on Street B and get right out to Pearl Parkway. You get into the Woonurf, that's directly to the south of that, and then you can go only west, really, to get out. and then it would be a right turn only, not going straight through the lights. So you would go into the pork chop and take a right.
Into the pork, I don't know what pork chop means, sorry.
I don't think I can.
Is it, so you don't end up on Pearl Street at all?
Correct. So that what looks like a double sidewalk on the south end, the southern double part of the double sidewalk is actually a street. So you come out to that, it's a little shared street for deliveries and people to stop. It's not intended for high traffic counts. And you take a right on that and you get to that little mouth that kicks out right at the corner. That mouth would allow you to take a right and head north.
So would that be a double, I'm sorry, there's already a turn north from Pearl onto 30th Street, so there's going to be a second turn?
Yeah, so that those two turns are, it's already built this way. They come together. So it was constructed as part of the overall city improvement plan that they did to Pearl Parkway. That whole section is not even proposed in this project. It already exists. We're just tying into it.
Okay.
We're going to pull up not yet.
Street view.
Thank you.
Not yet.
Then, Chris, do you want to talk about traffic counts on 30th Street? I think that would be useful.
Chris McGranahan with LSC Transportation Consultants. We were the traffic consultant for the project. It's important to note the access on 30th Street is a right-in, right-out only. It's not full movement. And so the only full movement access the project has is to Junction Place, which is the least busy road that we front. And the thought is that these two other right-in, right-outs help provide some relief to the traffic signal at Junction and Pearl. So if someone is coming from the west, rather than having to come in at Junction at the traffic signal, they can turn left on 30th and go into the right-in, right-out. So the idea was to have limited access on the two busy roads, 30th and Pearl, and have full movement access on Junction Place, which is kind of the lesser of the three roads. So that was kind of the intent, is to have some other access, but have it be limited so that it's just right turns, because they don't have as much delay, there's not as much congestion from right-in, right-outs, and have the full movement over to the east where we have less traffic, so the left turns are much easier to make.
Just add one thing to that. And I'm also in the area a lot because our office is over there. And you're absolutely right. On the west side of the street, there's so many little entries. The concern was that if people could come out and turn left, now you have conflicting lefts.
Right.
So we're trying to put people into the traffic flow immediately.
So no, I appreciate that, and I understand. It makes a lot of sense to make it right in, right out. And that corner is so busy all the time. I just have a feeling that the right out, and now I'm talking about Street A,
Yep.
the right out
Yep.
is going to end up backing up and backing up and backing up. And I just would like you to consider, and I realize this may not even be possible given the form-based code, that they be one-way streets in and everything feed out to Junction Place. And one-way streets in both are right in, and there's no right out on A and B on Pearl and 30th, so that they basically feed into the garage.
Got it.
And then you
I
can
think I'm
pull
getting
out
it.
and head out towards Junction Place. Because Junction Place now goes straight through. I mean, you can go,
yep.
right, you can go all the way to Valmont on Junction Place now.
So a couple things. The way the traffic model works is that every time the light changes at this intersection, then there would be a break to allow people to turn right out of this and head north. But that's one of the reasons why the parking ramp didn't work on the west side of the property, because just as you're saying, as that queue backs up, it won't be 50 cars, but it might be 6. That would block a traffic ramp, so that's a problem. So that's why that was moved over. While this is up, so this is the end of that multi-use path. The road's half constructed. We have to construct the right-hand side. You're actually taking a right-hand turn on the Pearl Street, so you have to wait. You have the right-of-way is given to the right turn lane, so you have to wait until the right turn lane is empty before you can take a right turn, and you can only take a right, immediate right onto the north.
So, but this pathway is like, I'm going to make an assumption here,
Yep.
that pathway is likely to be used by a lot of cyclists.
Yes, it is a multi-use
And
path.
that worries me, that cyclists and cars are going to be sharing. I mean, I appreciate the problem you guys are trying to solve, but I'm concerned that cyclists are going to be sharing a non-road road with cars. I see it already over on, with the very low curbs on Junction Place, that there's a lot of confusion as to what's a road and what's not a road, and where the cars are supposed to go and where they're not supposed to go. And I'm just quite concerned we're going to extend that problematic pattern.
Yep. So it's a reasonable question. So that road is not part of this project, and it was designed really as a pilot to see how this works. And the idea behind it is that it's a shared street so that cars, if they're really trying to get somewhere, they're going to go north on Street B. This is for slow traffic deliveries, pickups. You would see Uber through here. You would see people who are traveling at very slow rates of speed. It is intended, honestly, to slow down bikes as well as cars. Nobody's supposed to be using this as a thoroughfare. You stay on a bike path, you stay on Pearl Street. If you go onto this street, it's slow. There is a functioning version of it on the south side of the street right now. I would ask staff, have you heard any complaints on the south side to this point?
No.
Okay. But it is a pilot, so if it were to be put in and there were all kinds of conflicts, then I think the city would learn from it. But the only way to really learn from it is to put it in. It is designed not to be a thoroughfare street. It's designed to be a place for people to arrive and depart, maybe is the best way to put it. Is that a fair description? But again...
So Bill, I'd like to move on from this. I think that the street typologies are already described in the TVAP.
We can't change them.
We're not changing them here. And the purpose is there in the purpose of the TVAP to create the grid, and we're not supposed to be turning it back into super blocks. It's really, we're not talking about criteria that we're supposed to be applying here. So if we can move the discussion on, please. Any more questions for the applicant?
Can I ask it's a related question, and we may find that quickly that it is also out of scope, but the 30th Street, did we have any opportunities to improve the bike lane configuration on 30th Street since we're developing this? And I don't know if this is an applicant or a staff. It might be a, yeah, thank you.
Good evening, Edward Stafford, Development Review Manager for Public Works. So they're required to comply with the adopted street cross-section from TVAP on 30th, which they are doing. It does not bring in buffered bike lanes or anything of that nature because that's not part of an adopted transportation plan at this point. And so we're only able to require of them what's in our adopted plans, both through TVAP and the form-based code.
Okay.
And to add to that, there is contemplated increased north-south bike connection. That's the crosshatch pattern in the middle.
I did see that, yeah.
Yeah, so that is the bike Wooner for contemplated north-south. So that's how that is going to work.
That's fine.
Okay. I think Lupita had a question.
Yeah, I had one question regarding any trends on air quality in that area, given that you also have the junction and maybe buses. How is it looking so far? Because we are bringing more cars now. Is there any of your engineers that looked at possibilities of getting to high levels of air quality problems?
As part of the funding requirements for CHAFA, we have to look at certain environmental impacts of the project. Most of them have to do with noise, honestly. I don't know that there's air quality requirements because air quality requirements tend to be dispersed. So in other words, we have 70-mile-an-hour winds pretty consistently, or 30 or 20. So if there's an air quality problem at the foothills, it becomes an air quality problem here pretty quick. If there's an air quality problem here, it tends to move east pretty quickly. So since those are regional, they're tended to be handled by regional districts. The things that are local, though, we do have to look at. So these buildings are designed to reduce environmental impacts like noise.
Right, thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions? John?
Yeah, just to follow up on what I was asking about before about balconies and roof terraces and so on. I understand that's not part of the criteria we're formally considering tonight, but I'm just very interested to learn about that from you.
Yeah, let me flip over a couple of slides. Maybe this is a good one. Well, maybe it's this one. So, yeah, BHP, I should know this, and I don't. I apologize. How many units do you currently operate? 1,389. Okay, approximately 1,389 units. So over the years, they've kind of discovered what works well for them and what doesn't. I mean, it goes down to things like, there's a single refrigerator that they like to use. It works, it doesn't break, they can get parts for it. So that also applies to how people live a little bit. They have found that increased community and maintenance and the vitality of the units work really well with shared spaces. So that's the focus, less on the individual balconies. They don't get used as much as they could. The community spaces get used a lot. So all of these buildings have community spaces. Both 2A and 2B, we have the opportunity to do roof decks, so we are. There's public roof decks that are accessible to anybody in the building. They can go up there on the 3rd floor and look out to the west. So that we thought that was pretty cool. There is here, oh, maybe I'll show it there. So the interior of Building A on the 2A on the 1st floor provides an interior courtyard that's accessible to 2A and 2B. It's accessible to all their residents, really to anybody, but it's intended to be used by this group. So if you're in 2B or 2A, you can go on to either of the upper roof decks. You can go into this area, and those are all public amenity spaces that have, and I don't think we've defined what those features are, but they will have community features because that's what BHP does. On Building 4S, we have an outdoor balcony that's shared with the community on the corner, on the 2nd floor, and then we have this interior balcony here. There isn't an opportunity for roof decks because the form-based code won't allow us to go above a certain height, so we can't even do like a head house to get out. We would have to have an elevator, and we can't do that. So that's the best answer I can give you. That's how we're approaching the outdoor spaces. We do agree that the outdoor spaces are important. They're just being handled communally.
Well, thank you. I was just interested to learn how you're dealing with that.
Yep.
Could I just follow up on John for a second? Can you put up the slide of Building 4B, please? Yeah. So on page 13 of our packet, there's a rendering that shows that central stack as being kind of more light gray, and the window fenestration is really different. But this is the more current.
This is current, and I apologize for the colors. You know, we go through the process, and then at the end we send it out to a renderer to actually try to get the right materials. But we bring the materials here because the best representation of the material is the actual material. So yeah, the colors are better represented here, but I would refer to the boards for the best representation.
It looks like the design is actually really different on.
It's a little bit different. It still meets the form-based code. There's no difference in the compliance, but that 2nd floor deck is really the difference.
Right. So is that 2nd floor deck that's open to the elements?
It's available to the outside. It is not. It is intended as amenity. It is. If that's a sticking point, it is not something that's.
No, I'm just curious
required.
about the design. So those aren't windows. That's open. It's open sides.
There are windows behind it. It's got like 6 feet of deck there.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Sarah?
So it's, in looking at the design, it looks like there is some, I want to understand what's happening to the northbound bike lane currently on 30th Street and the existing pathways off of Goose Creek into that quadrant right now. They seem to have disappeared.
They haven't been changed, so.
Okay.
Yeah, so the idea is, the reason the building in the northwest corner steps back, there is a Piesco easement, and that requires a step back, but the reason that easement moves that way is because that Goose Creek bike path comes up. That's not going to be changed. The north wall of this property, south wall of the Goose Creek bike path, isn't contemplated to be changed either. And then, let me see if I have a rendering that shows this. The access point out of Goose Creek up to the bridge, up to the depot, is also unchanged. In phase 2, we will have a park design. It won't change that location, but it will flesh out around it, so we should review it together then and make sure it's all looking all right. But yeah, the access to Goose Creek is unchanged.
Okay. And the only other thing I'd like to just talk about or put on the table, given that there's a lot of 2- and 3-bedroom apartments, I'm assuming that a lot of the clients are going to be families, and I'd love to see at some point, perhaps in the 2nd phase, some sort of playground area.
Great point. So within the rules, the buildings can't be dedicated to any particular use, but as you noticed, some of the buildings just happen to have some bigger units. We hope there's families there. So yes, the park will have a play area in it. There's actually more natural type feature play structures in the pocket parks as well. But yeah, we'll have play stuff in the parks and in phase 2.
Right, thank you.
Any other questions for the applicant? No? Okay, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
So at this point, Cindy, how many people? We have 4 people signed up for the public comment section of this matter. And if anybody else who hasn't signed up yet wants to speak to this topic, then you can go up and sign in with Cindy. Okay? So I'm going to start with Greg Harms. And come up and state your name for the record.
Good evening, Planning Board. Greg Harms from the Boulder Shelter for the Homeless. I'm here to support the 30 Pearl project. As was stated a little earlier, there is a set-aside for formerly chronically homeless people in this project. 10 units set aside for what we call permanent supportive housing. The shelter is interested because we would most likely be the entity supporting those 10 units with our case management support. Permanent supportive housing is a evidence-based approach in addressing homelessness. It may seem obvious, but we finally figured out that the answer to homelessness is housing, and putting people in housing is the way to get them off the streets. It's had a lot of local and national support. I just happen to have a report here from the Municipal Court of Boulder. I think a total of 51 people that have been on the high utilizer list from the Boulder Municipal Court that we have housed over the last 10 years in the PSH program in partnership with BHP. Before we were able to house them, 1,694 municipal court contacts. After we housed them, 12. Nice. This is the kind of success that the programs have. And this will be 10 additional units to help us try to reach a goal of 200 additional units that we have for Boulder County for additional PSH. BHP has a great track record, and I think the shelter does too with this kind of housing. It's a great location for us. It's a really strong partner, and it's going to help us meet a lot of community goals, so I appreciate the support. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker is Leah Brenner-Clack.
Hello, I'm Leah Brenner-Clack, and I am with And Art Space, and I'm an advocate and implementer of public art in Boulder, and I'm the public art consultant on this project. I was first connected with BHP in 2016 when they contacted me about commissioning a mural for their Kalmia project that was getting redeveloped. They wished to do a mural in the community center, in the youth community center, and we worked with a Denver artist who was a graffiti artist, a Latino gentleman who does a lot of community outreach in his own community in Globeville. That was a really successful project. He connected with the kids there. And the reason I bring this up is because it's the same commitment to that community reflection through the arts that Boulder Housing Project is taking in this project, Pearl 30. So one of Boulder Housing Partners' mission points is to inspire vibrant communities, and one very effective way to do that is through art and creativity. For 30 Pearl, BHP is committed to invest in multiple installations of public art within the design of the community as a reflection of inclusivity, and a commitment to the cultural vibrancy of the community. The value of investing in the arts has been proven not only to enhance vitality in communities, but to stimulate creative culture and economy. BHP is electing to invest in public art, which I think is notable, and they're doing so to build a diverse and inclusive community in that way. To commission this artwork, we used an equitable approach, launching a national call for artists on the website callforentry.com. That's a free website for artists. It was a free call for entry. We received over 50 proposals from artists across the country, including local. In that proposal, we invited artists to create proposals based on the concept of inclusivity first, and also the idea of placemaking, human engagement, relationship to the environment, and Boulder's unique location. The proposals were reviewed and scored by a volunteer selection panel that was put together, and that panel included a young community member from Ramblon, a city public art administrator, a local artist, an arts nonprofit director, a local architect, and representative from Boulder Housing Partners. The rubric that we used to evaluate each proposal looked at areas of artistic excellence, context, diversity, and implementation capacity of the artist. So 4 artists were ultimately chosen for the project. And like Bill and Laura mentioned, they're in the preliminary phases now. The 4 installations are each going to be site-specific, and they'll engage people from different access points throughout this community. The art will contribute to the placemaking aspect of 30 Pearl. It'll amplify Boulder's creative identity as a whole. And we were committed to choosing a diverse selection of artists throughout the process. One of the artists chosen for the phase.
Wrap it up.
Yeah, I'll just wrap up. So one artist is local Boulder artist. The other 3 have spent significant time in Boulder. Last night, the Boulder Arts Commission offered their support and recommendation of this project, and we hope that by implementing public art in this way, that it's a model for future developers and private entities to implement and integrate public art into their projects.
Thank you.
And I also have handouts if anyone's interested in seeing the art.
If you want to leave some with Cindy, you can, and she'll pass them out to us. Thank you. Okay, so our last 2 speakers are Valerie Sorachi and Kurt Nordback. If you could be ready, Kurt.
Hello. My name is Valerie Sorachi. I am not only a BHP resident, but I'm also the board chair for Boulder Housing Partners. I'm here today to speak on both behalf of, or both roles that I have with BHP. As a resident, I know the importance of being able to live by grocery stores, restaurants, shopping centers, as many of our residents don't have cars or are limited to 1-car households, leaving other family members and spouses to kind of scramble sometimes to get just their basic needs met. So having 30 Pearl be our location for our families is just crucial because it allows them access to those important areas of shopping. And then also it's got bike access, bike trail access, multi-use pathways, bus stops. So for people that don't have cars or don't want to have a car, they can actually access those very easily. So it's just for our population, if they can't get to those, it just increases the stress. It increases their lack of connection to the community. It feels like we're not seen sometimes just because we struggle so hard to get our basic needs met. So having locations like this just really benefit all of our residents across the board. There's a huge demand, obviously, we all know, for affordable housing in Boulder. BHP works tirelessly to find projects that we can either develop or capture and retain for future affordability. And so this is just 120 more units that we would be able to provide not only to our residents, but also to Boulder's affordable housing number that we're aiming for, and we're really, really aiming for. So not only does this project help our regular audience of residents, our families, our disabled and our elderly, but also, like we said, we're holding spots for people in our community that really benefit from housing. So we're learning more from the Ramble On community about our citizens who really lack housing once they leave their family. They're like, you know, their family house, they really have nowhere to go. So this is something that we're really trying to find those individuals that benefit greatly from us. So not only our regular population, but really trying to help those really in need. And as the board, as board chair, I can tell you that our board is 100% behind BHP and the staff and just the relationships that they are building with the city and their patience in this project. And so they have our full support as a board. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Kurt Nordbeck, 777 Delwood Avenue, speaking on behalf of Community Cycles. We, as always, focus exclusively on the transportation aspects of these projects, and we're very supportive of this to the extent that it implements the connections, the TVAP connections plan, and helps to break up the super block there. So that part is wonderful. We do have a few points that we want to raise, and I sent a letter about this. First of all, the TVAP connections plan very clearly shows a direct straight connection across 30th to the west, and that is not what's being implemented here with the current location of the crosswalk. So it requires a jog one way or another, whether you're coming off the Paseo or you're coming off Road A, and that is just not the way we would design a motor vehicle facility. So we feel that that is not the way it should be, and how that should be fixed, we're not sure, but we definitely feel that it should be fixed. The plans indicate a 25-mile-per-hour design speed for roads A and B, and we feel that that's excessive for an area that should be very calm, very pedestrian focused, and so we feel that the design should increase the amount of traffic calming, basically, by reducing the corner radii. They're shown as 20-foot curb radius, which translates to about a 25-foot flow line radius, which is just too large for calm traffic. The curb face to curb face width is also shown as 36 feet, which again we feel is too large. I'll note I live on Delwood, and that's 32 feet curb face to curb face, and the city just installed traffic calming because somebody doesn't understand about traffic calming. They just had to install a speed hump there because people were going too fast. So that indicates that even 32 feet might be excessive. 36 feet we feel is definitely excessive. There's question, the TVAP connections plan shows a bridge over Goose Creek, and it's not clear what facility is provided for making sure that that happens. So we just want to make sure that that is possible. And then the last 2 points are kind of wish list. We understand the TVAP connections plan is what it is, but it originally was written in 2007 and I think updated in 2010. And thinking has changed a lot since then about how to design transportation facilities. And for one thing, the connections plan shows no crossing at Pearl at the intersection with Road B, which we feel is just an oversight. We feel that there should be a connection there, and I'll leave off the rest.
Okay, thank you, Kurt.
Thank you.
Anybody else, Cindy? No? Okay, does anybody else want to make a public comment before we close the public comment? Okay, and seeing no additional public comment, I'm going to close that portion of the hearing, and we'll go on to deliberation. And before we do that, Brian recused himself, but is there anybody who has any disclosures to make? I mean, some relationship beyond just reading what everybody else has had and what's in the public packet and a site visit. Anybody?
I can disclose I've been through there about 300 times in the last year, I think.
Hey, once is enough.
Would you bury something back there?
All right. So I think we have the key issues up on the screen, and so who would like to start with key issue number 1, which has to do with consistency with form-based code and the land use code? Anybody? Lupita?
Yeah, I think I can start.
Great.
I try to follow the checklist that they gave us. Thank you very much. It helps a lot to kind of check specifics. So based on what I read and certainly what I heard today, that the proposal is consistent with the regulations of the form-based code, with very few exceptions, which is, I think, outstanding, especially every time that you have hundreds of anything. Chances are, just by mere probability, something's not going to work out. So I was very impressed. But now I was surprised also that there were some inconsistencies at some point. You fix one thing, something else comes out of compliance. So I was happy to hear that you have tried your very best, and it seems that based on what I've seen, you have done a good job in meeting the various exceptions. So overall, I think that the plan is consistent. The proposal is consistent with the form-based code, and I don't know how you want to go about the second part.
Let's do those second.
In the exceptions, we can go next.
So does anybody have any specific comments that differ from Lupita's? John?
I agree with Lupita. I have a concern, though, and that is one that I've mentioned before, and that is the eastern side of the building that is along the, which building is it? 4B. I understand that it will not be commercial all the way along that frontage. And I understand also that there's some needs that may be associated with the use that would make it less appropriate for doors and entrances to be facing to the east. But I continue to be concerned about what the impact of that will be on livening up that area, which is something that the city has been concerned with for a long time, and trying to make that plaza as lively and engaging as possible for the public. And my concern is, and I'm not sure how to deal with it, because I respect the needs of what will be going on there, but I am worried that will become a dead space with curtains in front of windows, and I am wondering how we can avoid that. I would be grateful for any ideas, but that is my primary concern with this key issue 1.
Does anybody have any suggestions on the board?
Well, in one of the buildings, there are these red elements. I don't remember which building it is, but they seem to be almost referencing the RTD red arches. I don't know if that's what you intended, but perhaps that's one way of, I don't know if that's what it's for, but that might be one way of just creating a little more, I mean, it doesn't add people, but it might create some more physical.
Some optical.
Some optical, yeah. Something.
You know,
I just bring this up because I don't think it's a deal killer, but it's a concern that I have, and I think the city has been working for a long time on this.
I think the applicant has indicated that they could put doors in.
Yeah, so it's a fair point, and I think we understand the criticism. We're always open to input. We view this as collaborative. We can add doors and manage that on our end with this population. I think there's a lot of ways to do that. So if that's the direction the planning board would like to give, we can make that change.
Well, I would propose encouraging you to do that.
So I actually would not want a condition that requires them to put doors in because of the target population. They're talking about a population with special needs. I also think that the building meets the massing requirements and the length requirements for unbroken facade, which are meant to keep unbroken facades from being too long within the form-based code area. And with 120 units of new housing, retail on the first floor, and a neighborhood that's building out, I don't think that length of building without door penetrations would necessarily become a dead space when there's going to be a density of population that would put a lot of street life out on the sidewalk. So, to give the type of privacy that the tenants need in those spaces, that's the design that the actual user thinks is the best for that special needs group. And I don't know if having swinging doors when an individual tenant occasionally comes out or goes in is going to liven the street any more than, enough to really merit that kind of a design change. So I wouldn't vote for that.
You have a question, and I also have a comment.
I wanted to clarify, there's so many sides of these buildings. Are we talking about the one that basically is next to the parking garage exit?
No, 4B.
Corner of 30th.
4B.
Oh, third,
on
okay, got
Junction
it.
Place.
This actually faces Junction, the
Yeah.
Junction Road.
Right.
Looking at, you'd come out of your door and you'd be looking at the hotel. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Were you finished, Peter?
Yes, thanks.
Lupita?
Yeah, I actually was thinking as we were listening to this is, I'm wondering what the potential residents will think about will be something that will make it more appealing to them. So maybe it is an opportunity not just to keep it with the professionals, but actually with the people who will live there to get some feedback from them. I mean, at one point we were wondering how do we make something lively, and I was thinking, I wonder what teenagers would want there if they wanted to hang out there. So if we wanted to make it appealing and welcoming, maybe think about the populations that we're trying to serve and see if there are some particular things that we just haven't thought about. That would be my recommendation.
Would that recommendation be served by the design which has windows now but can be converted to doors?
I don't
Or are you
know.
talking about adding a condition that would change the design?
No, I think it would be nice to see if residents of the ones that we're expecting there, like disabled people, would enhance that particular area. Maybe the doors will be something that will be useful, maybe something else. Unfortunately or fortunately, I do not have disabilities and I haven't had anybody close in my family that would. But I will suspect that I'm oblivious to some of their needs. So if we can get that kind of expertise, I think it not only will show that we're trying to be inclusive, really, because we want to listen to the experts.
Or a combination thereof.
If I can suggest, I don't think we should make it a condition.
Yeah.
But I think it would be great if the applicant would consider it seriously, and it may be a real asset to the inhabitants there to make it easier for them to get into the depot square and actually engage with other folks rather than having to go out through the main entrance and all the way around the building to get to the depot square.
Yeah, could we ask Jeremy to, it looks like you have.
Bill, stop me if I'm going to say something that doesn't work with our process, please. So I think that I appreciate this feedback as well, and I think that if we could avoid a condition that was specific, so long as we could, in a way that keeps the process moving forward, of course, with the timelines we need to meet, gather input from potential residents, and make decisions based on that, we'd absolutely do that. That's in line with our objective and mission, so, yeah.
I have faith in you to do that, so I don't see the need for a condition, but I just wanted to wave that in front of you.
I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you for your comments. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so in the interest of time, we're talking about key issue number 1, which really some of the compliance with form-based code and land use code come down to whether we believe that the exceptions and the criteria for granting them have been properly met in key issue number 2. So just generally, in terms of general site design standards, building type standards, building design standards, does anybody disagree with Lupita's assessment and the ensuing discussion, or shall we move on to key issue number 2?
I would have a comment.
You have a comment? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with everything Lupita said. I would, I think that some of my questions might reveal that I'm a little maybe frustrated that we don't have an opportunity to improve the bike lanes on 30th Street, but I understand that the Colorado and 30th Corridor study only goes as far north as Pearl. We did hear one recommendation that perhaps a lower speed limit might be looked at, and like of 20 miles per hour instead of 25. I don't know if anyone's talked about that, but that sounds kind of reasonable to me. So, because they're very short streets. So I just thought I would throw that out there. See if anybody thought, I think, for little short streets like this, 20 seems very nice.
Just prohibit cars on it.
So.
Unless there's some issue that I'm not aware of with city code or something that Ed could speak to, we're certainly fine with that. I think for us, it'd actually be preferable. I mean, we're looking at seeing families there, and I'd be safe, so, yeah.
So I think there's two different issues here. One is what is the design speed, which is actually provided for in the design and construction standards. And the process we're in tonight, it doesn't really provide for a modification to that. The second is the actual setting of the speed limit on the street. And I do believe the code actually grants that authority to the city traffic engineer. So I don't believe you could do that as a condition of the approval of this item before you tonight.
Thank you.
That's good.
All right. So let's just move on to key issue number 2. Do we, the planning board, find that the exceptions can be met pursuant to the form-based code section, which prescribes how to meet exceptions? So let's do just by negative polling. Does anybody feel that the exception for surface treatment for the permeable pavers on the Paseo, number 1, exception cannot be justified with the exception criteria? Okay.
Are we okay with it?
So everyone is okay with it. So planning board finds that the first exception for surface treatment can be met. The second one on our handy decision matrix, thank you, Charles, is the maximum site impervious coverage per the form-based code at 65%. The applicant's proposing 76% impervious coverage. Is there anyone who feels that the exception criteria are not met?
I just have a question about the impact of such a high increase in impervious coverage. What are the implications of that?
So it's a target, and I think one of the things that's not super clear in all this is that they actually are providing additional semi-pervious area. And I think both Bill and I expressed how there's 18 inches of soil coverage above the parking structure. That can't, unfortunately, count towards pervious surface. So in many ways, they're actually exceeding it, but it doesn't technically count as permeable all the way to the groundwater, so to speak. I think what staff's indicated is that with those extra landscape provisions, that our feeling was it meets the exception criteria. The other piece of information that I'll add is in talking through this aspect with one of our other staff members, Carl Geiler, who essentially worked to create the form-based code and facilitated that process. He did say that the intent actually was to take it to 75% impervious, but the 65% was essentially a typo that was a leftover, and it kept going through the code, to be frank with you. And that's one of our code cleanup items that he's tasked with, but that actually is the information he gave me. So FYI on that.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments to that?
Just for, I guess in terms of information regarding, how we had our, 100 years or 500-year floods not too long ago. I'm wondering if that will have any impact on, like drainage that was 18 inches. Was that part of the design when they looked into that, potentially that being another flood?
I think that's a great question for engineering. I'm going to defer it to Edward on that.
Right.
We actually got 18 inches of rain in 2013 that week.
Yeah, so and there was supposed to be 100 to 500 year, and I think those are going to happen more often potentially, so I'm just wondering.
So generally, in terms of the impacts of this change in this one is not going to be significant, anything flood-related. You're right, in a larger scale, certainly. The more paved area, the more impervious, of course, the more runoff that we end up with. In terms of what's been mapped and what is master plan for the drainage in this area, what happened in here is not going to cause changes to that. The assumption for paved area is generally higher in those studies than we see frequently and than what we see even in this project. So there shouldn't be any major implications there.
Good to know, thanks.
I just have a question. Could streets A and B be paved with semi-permeable paving the same way the Paseos are?
Could, most certainly. It is not currently in the city standards. It actually has other implications to maintenance and operation, which has financial resource implications also, challenges to the utilities under the streets, a number of those things. Generally, we don't have pervious or semi-pervious public streets in the city. We do have a pilot in the Boulder Junction area of some semi-pervious pavers in some of those parking areas along Junction Place. We'll continue to monitor that and better understand the implications, but to do a full street of that is not something that's currently been thought of for the future.
Any other comments on exception number 2? Okay, so fair to say that through negative polling, Planning Board believes that exception number 2 has met the criteria. Okay. So exception number 3 of 8 has to do with the build to line. The form-based code requires a building forward design with a build to line of 5 to 10 feet from right of way, and here we have more than that due to a PSCO easement. Applicants asking for an exception to the build to line. Does anybody object to the meeting of the criteria for that? Okay, and Planning Board finds that exception number 3 meets the criteria for exception. Exception number 4 has to do with refuse and recycling utilities and loading zones. Any comments on that?
We didn't really touch on that in the staff presentation.
It's the transformer. I could have been more clear on the matrix.
Yeah, I was going to comment the criteria doesn't quite read like what we're actually looking at.
It's the utility location.
It's the utility location.
Okay. Any issues with that? And the Planning Board finds that pair of criteria are met for exception to that feature of the code. Number 5, building transparency for building 2B. Any concerns with that?
Again, it's connected to the location of transfer.
The art, it's lovely.
Besides the art being lovely, which more of a compliment than a concern? Okay. All right, so if there's nothing from Planning Board, we're going to determine that building transparency for building 2B is an exception that we are willing to grant and has been met. Next one is storefront transparency in building 4B's east side.
And if I may interject before you start discussing that, this actually should have listed storefront transparency and the storefront requirement itself. That's what you've been discussing.
Yeah, right.
But they're 2 separate requirements.
I just have a comment on that. I won't oppose it, but again, I have the same concern on that issue as I've described previously. And I would encourage the applicant to keep that in mind and when in its dealings with that stretch of the building.
So Heller, are you saying that you're asking us to consider exception 6 and 7 together, or are you just adding the storefront requirement into exception 6?
So it's not really listed expressly as an exception right now, that there's a storefront requirement. Once you guys make a motion, I recommend that we clarify that in there, and I'm happy to provide the language at that point in time.
Okay, then what is the difference between exceptions 6 and 7? They read the same on our matrix.
Yeah.
One is just whether you have commercial space there, and the other is the transparency, I think.
But I think we just handled that. We just talked about that as one exception.
I see the
Yes, I just.
I was looking at the memo, not the.
They were
Voted
incorrect.
Maybe it was just a typo.
Could be.
Some chair. I like what you're doing.
It looks like on the checklist it's a duplication,
Okay.
but the memo doesn't call out the storefront requirement.
Okay. So besides John's admonition to the applicant to consider livening the east side of 4B, as we discussed during staff questions and deliberation, does anyone have the opinion that we cannot find that the exceptions to transparency and storefront use on building 4B are not met? Did I say that right? I was talking for a long time. Yeah? Okay. So let it be shown that planning board found that storefront transparency and storefront use exceptions meet the criteria for building 4B's east side. And then finally, there's an exception being asked for the articulation of the base of building 4B, which isn't recessed more than 18 inches from the second floor as required. Staff finds that that exception has met the criteria. Does planning board agree? Okay. Okay, planning board agrees that the exception has been met, the criteria have been met for that exception. So does anybody have any more comments or, yeah?
I'll have a comment after we take our vote. Just
Okay.
a couple minutes.
Yeah, I think
I think we can take our vote first.
Yeah.
And before any motion is made, I have another comment.
Okay. So, Helen, I'm going to make a comment that kind of follows in with what Elaine was talking about with code cleanup, and then if you want to talk to the motion, that's great.
Sounds good.
So, when we were approving the form-based code back in 2016, maybe.
2016.
I remember going on the record saying that if something inflammatory, something a little exciting, like if Boulder won't know that it could be the site of the next, Guggenheim Bilbao unless we make room for that to happen. And I had urged the staff to write form-based codes such that it was clear to applicants that exceptions could be granted for good cause and to open the door to really good design. And what I'm disappointed by in reviewing the form-based code is that the two criteria for granting exceptions really read almost exactly like criteria for variances. You have to show that you didn't create the hardship. That is variance 101. Every Board of Zoning Adjustment in the United States applies that criterion. And I don't think personally that at least I wanted the form-based code to require applicants to have to show that level of impossibility in order to get an exception. And I think staff struggled mightily trying to get around that piece of the code, and in fact kind of admits that they didn't. In the recommendation, it says that staff has found the proposal consistent with the form-based code and exception criteria, but it talks about how in the conclusion, most of the exceptions are necessary due to existing conditions or programming aspects. So, the build to exception is a typical kind of exception that you would grant as a variance. It's due to existing conditions that are not created by the applicant. But the impervious surface maximum is an exception that's really due to the programming aspects. And it's arguable that, and this is where staff came to this conclusion, that because of the vagaries of the code and the other requirements that are kind of existing conditions in the TVAP, that you have to agree that that wasn't an applicant-created condition. And I think that puts us in a position that's legally dubious. Now, I happen to think this is a great project, and I'm willing to say that it's an arguable point, and I'm going to vote for the project, and I'm going to vote for all the exceptions. But I would implore staff to, when you do the code cleanup, think about how hard it was to shoehorn this thing into the exceptions and whether it really serves the purpose of our form-based code when you do that. So that's my comment. And I wanted to get that out before we vote, even if it throws a bit of a wrench into things. Hello?
In front of you, you should see a sheet of paper that recommends a slight change to the recommended conditions of approval.
In yellow?
And the change is actually in the last condition, condition 4. The proposed garage on the northern lot would encroach into easements that are required for the paseo and multi-use path, and the way that's handled in the code is permits have to be granted to the city for that to be constructed that way. And we had initially recommended that those approvals for the revocable permits be obtained prior to building permit application. That's not a legal requirement. It could also be prior to building permit approval, and we're recommending that that be changed to prior to building permit approval in light of the fast timeline the applicant has to meet due to the financing associated with this project.
Did you have another change that you wanted to make to the motion language?
Yes, I would also, so I prepared some revised motion language just for the change to the condition of approval, and then I would recommend that you also add to that, and with the following clarification to the findings of fact, an exception is granted for the storefront requirement along Junction Place as proposed in the applicant's plans, as the proposed exception would be consistent with the TVAP goal to develop a higher percentage of affordable housing on this site and would not create adverse impacts on residents of the development or surrounding properties compared to those that would normally be expected by meeting the form-based code standards.
Can you put that up, or can the motion maker just refer to the additional language that you just spoke?
I think you could just refer to that language. I only have it in handwriting.
Okay, all right, thanks, Helen. Okay, is there any more discussion or a motion?
I'd be happy to make a motion. All right. I would like to make a motion to approve form-based code review application number LUR 2018-00064, adopting the staff memorandum with attachments as findings of fact and subject to the conditions of approval recommended in the staff memorandum, revised as proposed by staff at tonight's hearing. And I would add the additional storefront condition language that Hella just read off. We can.
You want a second?
Yes, I'll
Okay.
second.
So we have a motion by Ensign and a second by Montoya. Any more discussion before I call the vote? John?
Yeah, I'd like to just say that I will be voting in favor of this, but I have some comments from our experience with this project and form-based code in general, and this might be the right time to make them. I was on planning board when the form-based code was developed. I have to say that I was not very enthusiastic about it then, and I continue not to be very enthusiastic about the process. I think we have made a decision to follow form-based code in this project, and therefore I'm in good faith doing so. But as some lessons for future situations come up, I'd like to say that I think that we are not serving the city well by using the form-based code to avoid discussing some of the issues which I think are appropriate and should be discussed in a project of this nature. And so in the future, when similar proposals come up, I will be more explicit about that. But I'd just like to go on record as saying that it seems to me that planning board should be explicitly discussing issues which are relevant here, such as, for example, density and building design in a detailed way, which we do not do when we're following a form-based code procedure. So that's my thoughts.
Any other comments before I call the question?
I'll build a little bit on John's comments. Another thing that just kind of an observation on form-based code, things do change after the form-based codes are written, and I do worry that we might lose opportunities. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about are green roofs, which a lot of communities are really trying to encourage. And if we were writing these form-based codes now, I wonder if we would be putting a priority on something like green roofs, which I think, so it just kind of, as we kind of think about keeping these form-based codes up to date, I think it would be useful to think about things that might fit in there.
Okay. Then call for a vote. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, the motion passes. Planning board's approved the project, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Going to take a 5 to 10 minute break right now.
Thanks, Hava.
So thank you for all for participating.
I would expect a packed house.
I want to hear more.
Peter, I'm going to go home now. Can you come up and do this?
Okay.
Okay, we're back from our break, and I lost my bet. I'd bet it was going to take 2.5 hours. It only took 2 hours and 5 minutes, so you guys beat my odds. So we've scheduled the next agenda item for another 2.5 hours. I hope hope we're good with that. So the next agenda item is 5B. It's a public hearing to consider recommendation to City Council to adopt an ordinance to amend Section 11-5-5, discharges to the stormwater utility system, and Section 11-5-6, master drainage plan, land development, discharges into stormwater system, et cetera. And so we're going to start off with a presentation from staff.
Good evening again.
Good evening.
I'm going to talk to you from up here now.
Promise or threat?
However you want to take it, I suppose. Hopefully not a threat. Good evening, Edward Stafford again with the Public Works Development Review. Tonight we're going to have a hopefully very brief presentation about updates to the design and construction standards and to the Boulder revised code as it relates to our utilities and stormwater program. The purpose of this is to look at the changes to both the DCS, the Design and Construction Standards, and the code as it relates to the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan policies and goals, and looking at it within the lens of Planning Board's purview on public improvements. And we are asking the board to make a recommendation to City Council regarding these proposed changes tonight. I do want to point out that we are talking just about utilities and stormwater right now. There are design standards in the DCS as it relates to the transportation system. Updates to those are still in process and will be brought forward at a future date. What is the DCS? We love our acronyms, so it's full of them, including the name of it itself. It prescribes our minimum standards that are used in the design and construction of public infrastructure that's located in the public right-of-way and in easements in the city of Boulder, and in addition, private transportation and utility improvements that connect to or may impact the public infrastructure. It is enacted through adoption in the Boulder Revised Code. Changes must be brought through this process into City Council. The DCS last had a substantial rewrite update back in 2000, so it is nearly 20 years old. Part of the reason why we're here to do some updates to it. In addition to that, we're bringing forward changes to the Boulder Revised Code in Section 11-5. This is the section that provides the regulations for the city's stormwater and flood management utility. It's important to point out what is stormwater and what is it not in this context. Stormwater is really the rain that falls from the sky and hits something on the ground or built on the ground and runs off into the major drainage way system. It is not what is sometimes called our sanitary sewer or wastewater system, and that is anything you may put down your drains, sinks, those types of things. So when it comes to the stormwater and flood pieces in 11.5, it's really about that which falls on the property and flows off. The project purpose and goal for this update was several things. The first and the most important for us right now was to bring us into compliance with a permit that the city holds from the state called the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System, or MS4, again, another great acronym. And there are requirements from that, which we'll go into slightly more detail in the presentation, that we need to have in place by July 1st of this year. While doing that, we wanted to take the opportunity to also update the DCS to make sure it recognizes our current practices, processes, and materials, and make sure it aligns with any other master plan or policy documents. Talking a little bit more about the MS4 to give some context. The MS4, the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System, regulations actually start at the congressional or federal level through the Clean Water Act, and it prescribes standards that have to be met and then delegates those standards and requirements to the state level. So in the state of Colorado, they have to implement the requirements that have the Clean Water Act. The state then gets to delegate that through the ability to require a permit for discharges from our storm sewer system into the drainage ways. And so that's where the city becomes involved and where we hold the permit issued by the state to allow those discharges in accordance with the Clean Water Act. The permit has a rolling timeline to complete certain items. It is typically updated over a 5-year time frame, so we continue to hold different permits. What does the compliance mean? So as we've already discussed, we hold the permit. It was issued in 2016. For history and reference, the city's first MS4 permit we were granted by the state was in 2003. As I mentioned, they tend to be updated on a 5-year rolling time frame. The permit has changed over time and has become more prescriptive, especially as technology has changed, as our understanding and approach to stormwater has changed. It's been an iterative process. So it started back those many years ago as more goal-based and not so much information or prescriptive direction. It is becoming each cycle considerably more prescriptive. Hence why you see the fairly significant change in the number of pages in the DCS related to stormwater. Again, the permit itself is what allows us to actually discharge the stormwater to the drainage way system, a vital and important role for the community. If we did not have that ability, I'm not sure we would exist here. Various measures and control measures have to be implemented, as we talked about that July 1st time. The city has to show that it has the ability to do these through its design, regulations, and standards and enforcement standards. The last item on there to note is there is fairly limited flexibility in the implementation of those control measures, so we can't elect not to do certain things, which limits some of the discretion, the authority we really have in this item that's before you tonight. What are some of those required changes that have precipitated this need? We need to have an expanded enforcement capability that really gives us a larger toolbox to ensure and to demonstrate to the state that we are actually able to enforce these standards in a variety of areas, everything from illicit discharge, which means somebody has likely placed, poured, or otherwise deposited something in the system that enters into our drainage system and ultimately in the drainage way that's not supposed to be there, that we have the right standards for the post-construction stormwater control measures, and that we're able to follow through with violations. There are also updates to the specific requirements in those construction and post-construction. That's the meat of the DCS chapters. We are updating to ensure that we're in alignment with what is allowed or not allowed to be discharged to the system, and ultimately also ensuring that we have the requirements in place for the maintenance of these after they're built. And that's a very significant issue under the MS4, is ensuring that what happens initially continues to be used into the future. We have conducted some community engagement on this, although somewhat limited, given the limited discretion here. The Water Resource Advisory Board has heard this item and have made a recommendation for City Council to adopt these. I know Member Gerstle was at those meetings here actually and heard their discussion. We also had a stakeholder meeting where we invited the design engineer and landscape contractor, landscape architect community, who are the ones most impacted by this in their design work, to hear about the changes and provide us any feedback. They had some excellent questions, pointed out a couple of things we needed to confirm in there, and were generally positive to the changes we made. We did give an opportunity for additional feedback to be submitted after the meeting, and we did not receive anything additional from that stakeholders group. The proposed changes in the DCS are to a number of chapters, as you see listed up here. I'm not going to read all of those chapters, but we will go through some of the changes that have occurred in each. In your packet, you had a red line strike-through version of each of those chapters and each of the changes. If you'd like the 3-hour session of this, we could step through every one of those, but I'm not proposing to do that tonight. If you have insomnia, it's a good reading book.
How disappointing.
Chapter 1 is the general requirements chapter. There are modifications in here to ensure that we have consistency with the changes in the other chapter. A nomenclature change, which includes converting the word stormwater from 2 words to 1 word, which is actually the current industry standard. That in and of itself is actually a fairly significant change when you start going through both the DCS and the Boulder Revised Code. We also are updating requirements for the review of plans to more current versions and technology. Believe it or not, the DCS right now still states that construction plans and other documents need to be submitted on Mylar, which is not a current industry practice or standard. Some of you are chuckling up there, understanding that that is an incredible expense for which there's not value today. There was in the past, but now that we have gone computerized and pretty much scan all of this information, those are no longer requirements that we need. Chapter 4 is the General Utilities Design chapter. There were a couple of items that have been updated in there that we'll highlight. The first is an increase in the vertical separation requirement between our, what we call wet utilities, so the water, sewer, and sanitary, and the dry private utilities such as electric, gas, and telecommunication. That's to increase that vertical separation from 6 inches to 12 inches. That's being made so that when we need to do maintenance and repairs, it's a little bit easier to do that and ensure that we don't damage those other utilities. Similar for when they're making maintenance and repair, that they don't damage our utilities. We like to respect both sides of that. There's also additional clarification in here on tree separation requirements between the utilities and trees that may be in the easements to ensure that we can actually access the utilities in those easements without having to remove trees in the future. That is a problem we occasionally run into today. It is certainly concerning to the community in an area where we take down a tree, and concerning to us in terms of the delays it presents to getting in and maintaining that infrastructure. We've also added new requirements in here about what needs to be done when a service line, so that's the connection from the line in the street to the structure, or what might have been a structure, when those are abandoned and how those should be, so that it's easier to realize if you dig across one of those in the future, what's actually been abandoned and that it doesn't have an impact to our system. Chapter 5 is the water design chapter, and there are very minor cleanup changes and nothing of significance to point out there. Chapter 6 covers the wastewater system, so that's the sanitary or the waste that goes down the drain system. Some minor modifications in here. One of them is a reduction in the maximum manhole spacing. That has come to our attention as we have seen challenges in some of the maintenance activities, jetting out lines, doing other rehab repair, and so having a little bit tighter spacing meets the industry standard and allows us better access for maintenance. Making sure it's clear in here that manholes should not be placed in stormwater detention basins, which tend to have flooding issues, and we don't want to introduce floodwater into the sanitary or wastewater system any more than happens by nature, and so that's added here. And then a new requirement to ensure that there are actually service cleanouts near the building on the exterior, and that relates to the ability to really maintain those service lines for the private property and ensure there's access to understand what may be happening if there's a blockage. The most significant changes are in Chapter 7, the Stormwater Design chapter. Very extensive, and you probably noted it went from a handful of pages to several dozen pages as a part of this. Most of those changes are related to ensuring our compliance with the MS4 permit. That included changes to conceptual, preliminary, and final drainage reports and stormwater management plans. Additional details on what needs to be in those stormwater management plans and permit requirements of such. A new section, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail here in a moment, about how and what should be selected for what's now called post-construction stormwater quality measures and their requirements. That is a change in terminology. Some of you have probably heard best management practice, BMP. That's been replaced with stormwater control measures in the industry. And then additional information. We've always encouraged to the best extent possible low impact development techniques, and there's additional language in here really clarifying that. Low impact development is talking about doing things that help to limit what stormwater runs off of a property. The best example I can give is not directly tying your roof drains into the storm sewer system, but somehow discharging those into a landscape or pervious area, letting them travel through there. There are other things also in low impact development. It really comes down to don't pave and connect everything straight up to the storm sewer system. So there are significant change in the stormwater control measures for post-construction water quality. In the current DCS, we don't provide a lot of guidance other than you need to do such, and the design engineers have to figure out what we mean by that. I at times have described it as they do a design and pass it across the table and we say, yeah, that looks good, or no, that's not quite there. We're changing that tremendously here to actually have a much more prescriptive design scenario that will ensure we're getting what the community desires here and what we need for the MS4 permit. So it becomes this 4-step process, with the first step being the desired. And as they step through that, if they can't meet it, they can look at the second. If they can't meet the second, they can look at the third, then ultimately the fourth. So the first is what's called the full infiltration standard, which is really about allowing as much of that stormwater as possible to soak into the ground and ultimately enter into the groundwater system. And what's above and beyond that would then flow off. And that's the best stormwater control measure you can have, and definitely the preferred, so it starts at the top. There are certainly many circumstances where that's just not going to be possible. In Boulder, that can be impacted by how high groundwater tables. And so if you just don't have the room or the capacity for it to infiltrate in, that's a challenge. Soil types at times that are not great for infiltration may not work. Some of our desires for development may not allow this. It would be difficult to do this in downtown, where we are building to the property lines and have certain standards we want to achieve from a community standpoint on that design. If that's the case, you move into 2, which is a partial, so still some infiltration, but the ability to also connect and move that stormwater quicker into the storm sewer, into the storm control system. If that's not possible for some of the reasons I already talked about, they can move into item 3, and that is where you really have no infiltration into the ground system, but it's still above ground improvements that are treating that water and putting it into the storm control system. And the last one, if none of those top 3 can be done, is what's called the alternative design approach. Those are things like underground cartridge filter systems, mechanical type processes and systems that at least treat the stormwater to meet some level of water quality. And that's the least desired option to be selected. It's all spelled out in the standards there. Other changes in Chapter 7 included some modifications and removal of certain redundant sections, referencing back to urban drainage and flood control districts criteria manuals and removing some of the stuff from ours, which is more outdated at this point. Urban drainage has full-time staff who are keeping up with the industry, with design practice, with engineering practice, and so we want to utilize to the best of our abilities the standards that they regularly publish. So we've removed some of the stuff that was in ours and actually refer people back to those manuals. It's also true of the actual design details of those stormwater control measures, and they do extensive research and continue to add to the library there. There's also clarification in here about when inlets are required. Believe it or not, we do have situations where people come in with designs and we have ponding water in places that shouldn't, so this is to ensure we don't have that problem. Also, some additional clarification about how you can or cannot discharge to roadside ditches and how those discharge into the storm sewer system to protect from debris. Finally, there's also a clarification about how streets are used to convey stormwater drainage. They do multiple functions. Stormwater is one. But we want to ensure that there's also clarity as to what is required to maintain the transportation and really emergency access in events that they're also used for drainage, and so that the goals of both can be met. So in other words, we don't want so much water being conveyed down the street that emergency services can't access through that area, and making sure that that's very clear in these design standards. Chapter 9 is the utility standards. This is material specifications as it relates to utility system, adding additional information, pipe types, bedding requirements, lots of great fun technical details there. It adds additional information about the testing that's required for the system. And then finally, we've added a new section in here about the materials that we use for trenchless pipe repair, which is being used by the city much more frequently than it used to be. It's actually fairly newer technology for the use and allows the repair, especially of storm sewer pipes, without digging them up. And as you can imagine, there's quite a few benefits there when you're able to just access from the manholes that are hopefully appropriately spaced and do those repair. Some of those repairs are actually literally replacing the pipe within the pipe. So we talked, there are also changes then in the Boulder Revised Code, and this is all related to the stormwater and flood, the MS4. That includes ensuring we have the right definitions in there that are working in accordance with the MS4 permit. Ensuring that we have what we need to require the erosion control permits for anybody that is disturbing ground through construction and what they have to do for that. Ensuring that we have the easements as necessary to access any of these facilities that are built for future inspection or even to allow repairs if necessary. Updating the requirements about what permits are needed to discharge groundwater into the storm sewer system, which is actually primarily managed through a state permit requirement. We've had a duplicative permit requirement that hasn't added value, so this is changing that. Provides additional enforcement options. As some of you are probably aware, most of our code is a criminal code. Sometimes using those enforcement mechanisms for these items isn't always the best or the easiest. So we've added additional remedies, including administrative penalties and enforcements. And finally, we will be making some updates to inspection permit fees for the stormwater facilities and erosion control permits so that we can, the resources we have, or the necessary resources we can provide to inspect all of these as they're being constructed and inspect their erosion control measures. Where we are, in front of you tonight, we are scheduled for a first reading on May 7th with City Council, the second reading on May 21st, making these changes effective June 20th, which beats the July 1st date that keeps us in compliance. And we certainly hope we stay on that schedule and manage to do that. That's the end of my formal presentation here. I do have the draft motion language when you're ready for it up there, but at this point, certainly entertain questions.
Thanks a lot, Edward. Does anyone have any questions for staff on this? John?
Yeah, this is just as exciting this time as last time we went through it. But there were a few issues that I think I mentioned in the RAB meeting, but maybe it's interesting to talk about them here. One is how this addresses the question of sump pump discharges. Nominally, I think that they're not supposed to go into the sanitary sewer system or the storm drain system, but it was unclear to me how this deals with that question.
Sure, so there are no changes proposed through here. Sump pump discharges are generally prohibited from the wastewater or the sanitary system through existing Boulder Revised Code standards. They can be discharged to the storm sewer system depending on the type of discharge. So for single-family permits homes, they're exempt from having to have a permit to discharge to the storm system. Other discharges do have to be permitted by both the state and the city to ensure that the right things are happening in the discharges that are occurring in there, but it is possible. You're right, the code does also have a prohibition to directly discharging sump pumps into the right-of-way or into alleys. It is a very difficult one to enforce and not one that we have found a great answer to there. Our first preference is really to see those discharges either along the ground and able to infiltrate, if you have a situation where you can do that, or into the storm sewer system so that they're in a conveyance that can move that water away.
So basically, the city is not moving too harshly on enforcing those arrangements then?
Correct, in terms of the discharges across property into right-of-way. If we do find anything connected to the sanitary, we typically do want to take action on those to ensure that they're disconnected from that system.
Right, so do these, does this proposed language deal with it adequately in your opinion?
I think it does for the situation we're in now. We may look at some additional language as the building code updates go forward in terms of what you need to do to demonstrate the ability to construct subterranean or basement levels.
I see. And then the other question, oh, sorry. Go ahead. Just to follow up. There's very little language in here dealing with general groundwater issues and wetlands issues in general, in terms of impacts of, for example, construction on raising or lowering groundwater levels in the vicinity of the construction activity. Is that as it should be, or do you see that it would be appropriate to deal with that more explicitly?
So the one area of code that deals with that at all, and it's not necessarily directly related to groundwater, is going to be the stream, wetland, and water body protection section of Title IX. Beyond that, because the city doesn't actually have a utility for managing groundwater, we don't have regulations related to the design of systems for groundwater there. That would be a policy shift, and in this update, we were really trying not to do policy change, but to just make updates.
And this is all stormwater, right?
Correct, primarily.
Lupita?
Going back to how do we deal when we have something like the 100 or 500-year floods? Do we have some sort of emergency process that happens, in the event? And for example, last time we had those floods, was there something that was in place, or did we learn something through that experience that was implemented or brought into, our regulations or ordinance? Even if the state itself did not, because for us, it was a very localized situation.
So the MS4 permit's really not related so much to the significant 100-year type of events, and in fact, there are recognitions that stormwater quality measures almost go out the window in those types of events in terms of what happens and the discharges that occur with that. The MS4 and the stormwater system requirements really related to the more common normal storms, regular storms. Regulations as it pertains to protection for the 100-year and 500-year are through our floodplain development regulations in Title IX, which is separate from this project, and that's in trying to ensure that what is built is safe or protected from the harm of significant flooding events.
Any other questions? David?
In the BRC changes, there was a removal of a stormwater and flood management plan that was required. Was that one of the redundant things that you were talking about that is being handled somewhere else? Or I just wanted to verify that.
The requirement still to do those types of drainage reports hasn't changed. There was the need to change some terminology and make sure we were not being duplicative in different spots. So we have not relaxed the requirements. In fact, we've probably enhanced some of them in terms of the material that has to be provided. So that was really just cleanup that was occurring there.
Okay. Yeah, because I noticed that it referred to best water quality, best management practices, which talked about pollutants and stuff. And I just assumed that somewhere in the report specifications. I didn't see it, but okay. Thank you.
Other questions?
Comments?
Yeah, I guess we should open up to public hearing, though, to see if we have anybody who's interested in speaking to us.
Does staff want to testify? I do have some technical experts here.
I explicitly want to hear from Amanda, actually. She's the one I want to get up here.
She's been waiting anxiously.
Yeah.
Amanda has been our project manager to keep us moving along and provided great. I probably should have introduced staff. So we do have Candace Owen on the staff, who's our stormwater quality engineer, our technical expert in a lot of this and has been leading some of the charge in the stormwater ones. And then Peter Beyer, who's our engineering services manager and utilities as part of our capital program, who helped lead the charge in some of the other updates you've seen in here.
Cool. Well, Candace and Amanda did a good job of keeping me entertained while I was recused from the previous item, so I appreciated that. Comments?
Okay. So, our purview here is because there are code changes involved and we're the planning board and we need to make a recommendation to city council around proposed code changes. But I think that so much of this has very, specific to really understand it, you have to have really specific engineering knowledge. You know, maybe there are people on planning board who have a bit of experience in ditches and laterals or in construction standards or easements. But most of this is pretty technical. So I want to reserve my comments for something that I think is more of a planning boardy kind of comment that's, I think I'll tie it into, you know, the language in your staff report to the point where I think I can make the statements that I'm going to make, that they're related. So, you know, our role per the report is to evaluate consistency with the comp plan and policies, as well as to evaluate the proposed changes within the context of our role to approve of the city's capital improvement program, which we're involved in every year. And the DCS prescribes minimum standards to be used in the design and construction of public infrastructure, but also with private utility improvements that connect to public infrastructure. And our permit includes requirements that the city has to implement and prevent stormwater pollution. And you talked about our desire to keep stormwater from entering the wastewater treatment system. In the 2013 flood, our sewer treatment plant, which is supposed to run at averaging 10 million gallons a day, pegged the meter at 50, kept going, and the meter blew out at 70,000 or something, 70 million gallons one day, and the storm treatment plant, the sewage treatment plant was overrun by stormwater. And when we talked about a $20 million upgrade to the sewage treatment plant, I was really perplexed during that meeting as to how a storm that put a lot of surface water on the ground managed to overrun a sewage treatment plant, which is connected to nothing but sanitary sewers in a city that's too new to really have combined sewers like old cities. And I was told that we have this problem where, you know, all these old clay pipes that serve as laterals for all these old 50s houses in Martin Acres and Newlands are cracked, and when the hydrostatic pressure increases due to stormwater saturating the groundwater up to a point where we now have hydrostatic pressure over these pipes, that now water is going into these pipes. And, you know, normally the danger is that black water is coming out the cracks of these pipes and polluting our groundwater, and then it reverses direction when the hydrostatic pressure increases in that situation. And so I think that we can tie, maybe not for your purposes of getting this permit approved by, you know, by July 1st, but I want to put this on the radar again, that, you know, if we're willing to spend $20 million on upgrading a sewage treatment plant, that would pay for a lot of organic, granular, neighborhood scale improvements to these old cracked pipes. And, you know, I know everybody on my block spends $175 a year getting the roots cut out of their pipes. So that's a recurring cost. And then when it finally gets too bad, or when the house sells and you can convince the seller to give you a kickback on the purchase price so that you can get a new lateral put in, you spend $10,000 and you get the lateral replaced with a new black iron pipe or PVC. And I think the $10,000 is probably half in the mobilization cost for the digger, to rent the backhoe and get it out there. And I'll bet you that if the city were to pilot a program whereby you had a person go out and knock on doors and ask everybody on the block, would you participate in a program whereby your whole block would get new laterals all at the same time? If you have a block with 20 houses on it and you get 8 or 9 people to say, well, yeah, the cost per house goes from $10,000 to $3,000, $5,000. I mean, you've got all the people out there, you've got all the machines out there, you can do it all in one day. And I just think that, you know, at the end of the day, it improves our groundwater quality. We've got this, it's not a ticking time bomb, it's just this constant leak that's happening. And then under certain circumstances, it becomes a gushing opposite of a leak. And I think this is an opportunity to do something that I've seen these types of community-led public-private projects create a level of communication and harmony on blocks that never existed before. You know, maybe you have a meeting at the house of the neighbor who has the biggest living room and people who never met each other, who live 4 doors down, are suddenly sitting in each other's space and talking to each other and agreeing on what the specifications are going to be for the pipes and how we all want to do this together. And I also know from looking at some of the diggings that I've seen in my neighborhood that sometimes even in the middle of the summer, you know, the groundwater is high enough that somebody's got a lateral that's wet. And when they go, so that's a pipe that might be actually mixing groundwater into our wastewater stream all year round, even without a flood. So anyway, that's something that I just believe that, you know, the city could think about, and it would meet the goals of this permit at the same time.
Really well put. I think it's a great idea. I wish I had a comment to make that was as like pithy and great as that, but does anyone else have any comments for staff? John?
Yeah, I intend to support this. I think, you know, it's timely and well done. I think it's incomplete, though, without explicit consideration of these groundwater issues that I mentioned earlier. And I understand that that's not explicitly required by the MS4 permit, but I think it is of significant concern to the city. As you know, we've dealt with a number of issues where groundwater is a factor. I'm thinking of Hogan, Pancoast, and others. And so I think that the city should be developing policies and approaches for dealing with those issues where they are important, and that this process may be the appropriate one for them to do that. So that my suggestion is great with this, but don't stop with it.
Any other comments?
If I may just continue your comment, because I am one of those neighborhoods where we do meet in the summers regularly with my neighbors, and we talk about things like this. And when you were speaking, before you got to that comment, I was thinking, this would be an awesome way to promote community. So if it's some sort of initiative coming from the planning board said, well, you mentioned that, you know, just getting people together will bring the price down. I don't know if the city has that purview of maybe providing incentives. So maybe on a small contribution, or maybe applying for grants from the city, and people can come as a community. You know, like I live in a cul-de-sac, we have a number of people, and like I said, if it was something that can be promoted and then let people know, because once you get this ball rolling, you say, this is something that the city is promoting, and one of my hopes in coming to the board is contribute in some ways to increase community within the city. And I really love that, because there are many different ways you can do that, and this is definitely one way. Thank you.
Cool. Any other comments?
Well, I'll just add a kudo to that. I was one of the $10,000 people, and people on my block are doing it one by one. It's Park East neighborhood, very similar to Martin Acres. So yeah, I think that would be, that's a lot of people feel that they feel this sense of, wouldn't it be nice if there was some sort of program like that, I think, because it is a big expense, and we know that everybody in the neighborhood is going to have to do it eventually.
Great. Any other comments? I was going to say I love seeing the low-impact development stuff get highlighted and furthered as a part of this. That's a real meaningful change. So thanks for that. And thanks for all the work staff did. I know you guys did about 10,000 hours of work compared to the 14 minutes we've done here. So
Unsung heroes.
So I'd like, actually, if you don't mind, a moment for Chris Maschuk to talk a little bit about some of a project that he helped pilot that related to some of the resiliency and some of these pieces that you're talking about.
Cool.
Sure. If the board's open to it, just to share a little bit of, we've explored this arena a little bit, because it's something that we experienced for some of the new board members. After the 2013 flood, I spent a 3-year special assignment doing flood recovery for the city, where I was directly working with homeowners that had been either displaced or were impacted by the flood. Part of what we did with utilities is we discovered that a lot of folks in the city, their basements flooded or their homes flooded, and it wasn't from a creek or a river, it was from rainwater. And it's because we got so much rain in such a short amount of time, the water table came up so fast. But as we started to then talk to them and ask them questions, we realized the grading at their house wasn't appropriate. It was headed towards the house, so water in their yard was flowing up to their house and into their basements, or their gutters weren't connected in the right place, or their sump pump was connected to the sanitary sewer, or their sump pump shot straight out the wall, straight back down the wall, back into the, like it was going in a circle all the time.
Hard working pump.
And so we started holding these community workshops to just educate people about basic homeowner maintenance, and it was like people loved it. It was super fun. We did 3 of them. And then we realized, hey, maybe this is actually something we need to explore further, and specifically related to issues of sanitary sewer laterals or your service line, and then the tap where it taps onto the sewer main. And so we actually applied for and received a grant from the state of Colorado from HUD, a disaster resilience grant. And we piloted doing resilience audits and improvements to 200 homes in Boulder, and then there were some homes in the unincorporated county that received this as well. And so if it's helpful, I can try and find, I think we did a final report on that evaluated like what were some of the benefits, what were some of the costs, what are things that maybe communities could explore in the future of running a program like this. So it's a really interesting thing, and to think about, especially in times where systems get really surged, like in times of heavy rainfall or in disaster. How can you mitigate that point where now we're not just treating wastewater, we're starting to treat groundwater, and that system really isn't designed to do that. So I'll see if I can find the report. If I can, I'll send it to you.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Chris. I appreciate that.
The other thing I would point out is it's not just those laterals. That's some of the challenge with our older mains, and that's hence the trenchless technology, which you see quite a bit of work happening in that. I'm trying to recall, and I don't remember the figures of how many miles we've worked on since 2013. I don't know if Peter has that in his head. We do about...
So Peter Byer, Engineering Services Manager. So we do about 14 miles a year. The collection system, city owns about 380 miles. Approximately 70% of it is that clay pipe post-World War II construction. And after the 2013 floods, with the rate increases that were brought forward after that, the goal was set to rehabilitate all of that city-owned clay pipe in a 20-year cycle, which is one of the more aggressive programs in the entire United States, I'd probably say, just in terms of percentage per year. So we're kind of on the forefront of that. And yeah, about 14 miles per year on the city-owned side. Going back to, I wanted to add on the pilot project, we also did from our end a pilot project that looked at the connection point of the laterals to the main, because technically the city ownership ends essentially where the hole in the pipe is, and even the saddle connecting to it is owned by the homeowner. We did a pilot program in Fraser Meadows on a 2-block stretch to do a rehabilitation of that connection point and the first 3 feet up. It was really well received. Pretty much everybody that we approached decided to participate. It was completely city funded at the time. What we came up with was that the technology wasn't quite there yet, where there was issues in the installation where it was supposed to be trenchless, but we actually dug up 2 homes. 2 yards and 2 homes, and that didn't really help the public perception of the project too much. So it's very much an evolving technology market. That's why we have some of these updates in here, and we're waiting for some of those newer technologies to catch up with the truly sense of the trenchless word before we can go after it. Another component of that is that in addition to the rehabilitation, we're doing really extensive condition assessment. And so the first real full cycle of inspection of the complete sewer system since the flood was actually just completed in November. And we're processing all that data and have started to identify those neighborhoods that are the worst impacted by those groundwater issues. And so that will be then fed into the next logical process of how do we address that? We can address half of it essentially by looking at the city mains. The other half, we'll have to work with the homeowners. So now that we have that information, we can start looking at programs like you mentioned, where we go into specific neighborhoods and do that targeted outreach.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else? Maybe a motion?
I would move to approve the
or recommend
the motion, or recommend to City Council to approve this motion as shown up on the wall.
We have a second? Second. Lupita seconds. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, passes unanimously.
Thank you.
We dragged out as long as we could, guys. So we only have, that completes our public hearing items for the night. And then we're going to talk about sort of 6B now, which is the discussion of retreat topics, because we moved 6A to the beginning of the agenda. And so Cindy has put together or compiled the list of things that folks sent in as retreat topics. She's also talked to Kurt Fernhaber, and as you guys probably saw via email, or I'm not sure if that went to everybody or not, he said he's happy to come speak with us. So we'll have access to him, and I think he's going to be, of course, speaking on whatever he thinks he should speak on, but really focused on the same sort of stuff that we directed. Cindy, you want to chime in?
Yeah, Kurt was very quick and responded to me. He would just like to know, he said it's a topic that's very close to his heart, and he's looking very much forward to it. He would just like to know how much time he would have for the whole topic and when. So just, do we want him to come at the beginning of the retreat, the middle, the end, and how much time are we going to allow him?
I would say, actually, in terms of our schedule, and see if everybody agrees with this, that coordinating staff's schedule is probably more important to them than to us. We're blocked out for the entire time, and if Kurt comes in the beginning, middle, or end, it's fine. And we've also got Charles and Hella and you and whoever else who's going to be there as well. So I just want to say that I guess it makes more sense to coordinate internally than anything else. And in terms of topics, my sort of angle on that is, what barriers do we face as a city in terms of providing socially just housing? That's sort of my angle on that. And I think in terms of time, we haven't really banged through the rest of these ideas, so we don't really have an ability to say how much time we have. We know our total amount of time, but we don't know how many other things we have on the agenda, so maybe we should talk about that as we kind of push through this and winnow down our list. What do you guys think?
Sounds good.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got, we'll need some time to talk about the liaison and ex officio roles. And maybe we should just start trying to put some times to these as we talk through it. I mean, it's sort of a mandatory one we've got to go through. And do you guys think like maybe half an hour is enough for that? Do a full discussion?
That sounds about right.
I think we should probably spend less time talking about how things are going and more time just assigning them. Because we get regular reports from the liaisons.
Yeah, and I think the question of, I guess the only question I think that's maybe open for this year is last year we experimented with adding liaisons to TAB and RAB. And so I think maybe it's worth just sort of checking in on how that's going. But the other ones, I think it really is just a question of like who wants to do it. And then we can have a celebrity death match over, who wants to be on landmarks.
So is it correct that there are 4 boards that were required to provide membership on landmarks, HAB, Greenways, and DAB?
Yeah, I believe
Nothing
those
else?
4 are the ones that we're required to have an ex officio member on.
Okay. All right, then, yeah.
I think maybe 2 through 5 are all essentially one discussion. I think, as we've all joined the board over the years and, how to craft an effective condition and how to make a motion and kind of going through the choreography of that, and also talking through sort of the thorny spots. Like what happens if you've made a motion, you've got a second, somebody asks for a friendly amendment, you turn it down, it becomes a unfriendly amendment, it gets voted in, and then you're voting on a motion that now carries with it an amendment that you don't like. There's just a lot of really interesting things that can happen through that. And I think it's good for us to talk through how that goes so that you don't get blindsided by it, like we all probably have at some point. And Hella's been really, really helpful with us, springing us from the traps we set for ourselves over the years, but also helping us get informed about how to do this stuff in advance. So I think that's probably going to be, I'm sort of assuming that's going to be a Hella-assisted item.
Yeah, last year, Hella did lead that discussion, and I don't know if you can dig up your notes or
got it.
If that wouldn't be too much for you, that would be great if you did that again.
Yeah, she provided a document on that. Remember?
Could we try to do some fun with it, like actually enact such as
Good role play.
Role play. I mean, I used to plan students in my class when I was trying to get discussions going about climate change, because everybody's going to be in favor of doing something about it. And then I will get some of my graduate students to come and pretend that they were against it, just so that people, get riled up a little bit and have to defend it. I mean,
Shills.
sometimes
Maybe we
you
could bring
get more
some of
out of that.
Maybe we could bring some of the people who didn't get on planning board for that.
That would be fun. We could also role play as each other. Like I could be David, Harmon could be John. It'd be really fun.
Yeah, well, that's what I always found. Sometimes you gotta be put in the positions that you're not comfortable with.
Yeah.
When you really have to think,
Yeah. I think I just made everyone uncomfortable with that idea. It was Hella's already reaching for the mic. No, don't do that. So then I haven't read through all these either, so I'm just kind of going as we go.
I didn't respond, I confess, to Cindy's emails with saying where we should come with proposals for the agenda. But there's one.
Should we maybe do yours at the end after we go through the rest of the others?
I didn't realize you hadn't gotten there.
Yeah, so I was just continuing to get to Lupita's suggestion. There's a printout of them in front of you if you want to follow along.
There is?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was part of the pack.
So how much time do you want to budget for 2 through 5?
I was going to say, that sounds like 45 minutes.
Yeah, I'd say 45 minutes seems like a reasonable chunk for that. Hella, does that strike you as
How much time?
45 minutes?
Yeah, that seems fine. And then one clarification for when to ask questions of staff, the timing of that. Is that during the board meeting? Like, let's say we have a site review and...
No, I think that was, I sent that one in. I was thinking more about, we've had discussions in the past about making sure you email questions to staff on an agenda item with enough time for them to respond, just out of courtesy for them.
Okay.
With enough notice. So like, we also have had board members email questions of staff at like 5:37, and so nobody on the board's seen it, and staff hasn't had a chance to respond, and then they get this sort of like, well, have you checked your email yet?
So Helen, why don't you punt this to Charles? Because I think what happened was 2 years ago or 3 years ago, we came up with a policy.
We did.
And we agreed that if planning board meeting's on Thursday, we're going to ask the kinds of questions that just take up the public's time, like staff interpretation of a code provision. And you got one board member asking a question that maybe the other 6 board members already think they know the answer to. That's a perfect example of a question that needs to be delivered to staff from an individual planning board member by a certain time, and maybe shared with other the answer is shared with all other planning board members. And I think we had said something like you have to have those questions in by Tuesday at noon or something like that.
That's my recollection.
And then we were good about it for about 6 months, and then we all fell off the wagon.
Yeah.
So I remember Charles making that portion of the presentation. So you shouldn't burden yourself with that. You should make Charles
do it.
Yeah, I'll
regurgitate
talk
that
with
material.
Charles. I get the questions too, so
Yeah.
we work on it together.
Okay, well then I shouldn't tell you how to do your job. I'm just reminding you how.
And I think one other piece of that was sort of when to copy the rest of the board and when not to. If I'm reading through a packet and, just if I have a curiosity question that comes up and I want to find out something about some document or where some report from 1976 was, I might email the staff person directly and not copy the planning board, because it's not really going to enhance the conversation. It's me just satisfying my curiosity a little bit. Or like, hey, it refers to something in the packet that I can't find. Can you point me in the right direction? That's not something that has to be spread to everybody. So just having a little bit of like sensitivity about like, I think what is useful to have in a bigger discourse is what I was thinking of there. And also the sort of number 5, the board preparation for a meeting. I think there's just a lot of things that we can do on our own to walk into the meeting prepared. And, reading the packet is a really good one to do. But also knowing where to find things. And that's why I send out that like sort of like, welcome to planning board. Here's where there's some like handy links. Because it's hard to find your way through all this stuff. And there are actually still some things that in terms of links, I have a link to something, and I could not possibly find it any other way. I've tried. I'm like, I know there's this map, and it's just gone on the website, except for this link. So I think there's some stuff like that that might be something for us to talk about how to get ready for a meeting. Yeah.
Sounds like these are all board etiquette questions, in a way, board management, board etiquette, and maybe other questions will arise, especially among the two of us who are new, that if, without knowing for sure what they are right now, if we can bring them in for the retreat, that would be helpful.
Maybe we could budget an hour instead of 45 minutes, just because I think this is probably going to raise some conversational points and additional questions and curiosities.
Yeah, it just took 10 already.
Yeah.
Before we even teed it up.
I thought of things like we're supposed to avoid replying all in a lot of circumstances, and avoiding serial meeting kind of scenarios, that kind of
sunshine laws, a little refresher on
a refresher on that.
Might be
Let's
good.
save this
Well,
for
we're
the,
adding that too.
retreat. Let's just say we're going to talk about it at the retreat.
Sounds good. And Lupita, do you want to speak to your item number 6 that you put in here? Do you want to? I'm putting you on the spot.
No.
Okay.
In fact, I, as we were having dinner, it occurred to me that maybe we already have an expert person who can talk about, bringing communities together. Since our illustrious partner here just came from Israel doing that very thing. So one of the things that I would really like to work on, in the city of Boulder, is this idea of really creating community. And we have some comments from various constituents who come about that they are rather segregated parts of our community. And I would really like to find ways in our own, small area to put forward activities we can build community, so that when we have an opportunity and it just comes up, we just pounce on it and make it happen. So at least for this retreat, I thought that even for us to be on the same page with regards to what do we think constitutes our community. So in terms of, for example, who do we have in this city that should be part of our community? Also, what kind of resources do we have? And resources is not just the beautiful natural setting that we have, but also economic resources as well as the human resources. Cultural resources, I didn't put it in there, but as we're trying to come up ways to really create the society, this community, it is to me connected with the idea that by being aware of what we really do have and how we can learn to leverage all of these pieces, that we can really set a different standard for other big cities. And I would like to think that Boulder has the opportunity, because I think we're on the beginning of the real explosion. Like something that happened maybe to San Francisco, 30 years ago or something, that we can do it right by keeping these things really clear in our minds, that we have all of these various resources and we can just use them in a way to really set us apart. So anyways, that was kind of like my idea on putting those things on the board, on the paper.
So I'd like to make a suggestion around moving agenda items around. I think if we started just with one, and then maybe that's a half hour, and then we went through 2 to 5, and that was an hour. When are we starting? 8:30?
12 to 4:30.
Oh, it's the afternoon.
Well, yeah.
Okay, so we're starting at 12?
Yeah.
So, if we did 12 to 12:30 and then 12:30 to 1:30, and then we had Kurt come and at 1:30 to kind of tee us up, and then Kurt can either stay or leave for this discussion. It will be unfacilitated and just an exchange of ideas among planning board members and potentially staff if they'd like to weigh in at all about anything that triggers in their minds around city policy.
Or stormwater.
Or stormwater, maybe pipe inserts.
Yeah.
But I guess my idea is just to, kind of cue us up with Kurt talking about, social justice and housing, and then we can broaden it to, the whole community issue that Lupita's bringing up, because I think our juices are going to be flowing around that after Kurt presents to us.
Yeah, I think that's a cool idea. I like the idea of talking about how to build community. I'm less concerned personally with how to be the city on the hill and radiate it out to everybody else. More really concerned about how to do it in Boulder, but I'm in line with that. So
That sounds good to me.
how long do you guys think we should give Kurt to talk about sort of social justice housing issues? I mean, not just Kurt's presentation, but like our discussion.
Feedback. I mean, the conversation that comes after that.
Yeah.
I mean, 20 minutes is a long time for someone to talk. I think we'll take 40 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes to talk after it. So 45, they could go into a 15-minute break as people then can take a conversation and expand it as needed, while other people might need to get a break, because the conversation is not going to end on a dime.
Does 45 minutes seem like enough to you guys, or?
Yeah, and he doesn't speak for 45 minutes. Let's make sure we
Totally,
expect
right,
him to do that.
Right.
And it can be a back and forth the whole time, really.
So are we at 4.5 hours for the, is it 4 or 4.5? 4.5, yeah.
Yeah, 12 to 4:30, so.
So 45 for Kurt and then half an hour for our conversation?
We are going to have lunch in there too, so everyone arrives a little early and grabs their lunch, and we can eat while we are discussing, and we just start at 12? Are you saying that we start right at 12, or do we start at?
And we start at 12 and work through the more dry or
The dry stuff.
whatever stuff.
The nominations?
Yeah.
Let's see if we have time to just have lunch without programming it. Maybe 15 minutes, the first 15 minutes.
Yeah, someone's gonna be 15 minutes late anyways, so. But the only way to train people to not be late is to start without them. You're forewarned. But yeah, so if we give ourselves like 15 minutes to like grab food and sit down and like, because that takes time no matter what, so.
I think we should work, yeah, I agree that we get going as soon as possible and work through lunch, but if we
12.
wanna ease into it 12.
Yeah, so 12, we get there, and you can get there early if you want. The doors will be open, and we can grab food, sit down, shoot the breeze, and then move into the liaison ex officio kind of conversation, and then move into the how to make, board etiquette or board decorum or board process conversation. Then Kurt's discussion and presentation, and we could take a break, so I think that's a good idea at that point, and then move into the discussion about community building in Boulder. There's just so much cool stuff to talk about that. I mean, I could talk about that for like 4 hours on its own. So that might be at least another 30 minutes for that conversation, given that it's sort of blended with the previous conversation from Kurt. And then
We can even give him a heads up, and so he can transition us into that.
And then looking at the last thing we've got in this so far, before we ask for more ideas, we got Chris and Charles talking to us about how things are going organizationally, some of the recent big wins, where there's some big losses. We should have some big losses on there too. Significant challengers for city planner, challengers for city planners, significant challenges for city planners, I think is probably what that's meant to say. But I know there's some significant challengers for city planners too. We meet them on occasion. And how can planning board make things smoother? I think that's a really valid question. And so Chris, do you think like a half an hour for that section's enough? Okay.
And by the way, I think I suggested this one. Challenges is the politically correct way of saying losing or.
Oh, oh no! It went in as it went in as challengers, not challenges. So it's sort of like looks like there's a somebody who's trying to storm the castle or something. So where we at? You were doing some math. So it's 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 3:30 right now. So we've got another hour to squander on this stuff if you guys want to. So John, you had ideas?
I thought it would be interesting.
Sorry, John, Cindy's trying to say something.
I'm sorry, how long were we giving Chris and Charles? 30 minutes?
30 minutes, yeah.
Thank you.
And again, I think that piece could move around depending on what's convenient for everybody. I don't know. Chris, are you and Charles planning on being there for the whole enchilada? Okay, so you don't care either. And how
are we going to have Mexican food?
I don't know. It's up to Cindy.
It's up to you.
She gets to pick.
Sounds yummy.
Let's get it from that new place, the whole enchilada. It's great.
We should just bring the food truck down from the gas station.
Let's talk about
awesome.
We could do waffles.
Chicken and waffles.
Wapos.
We did a
Yeah.
blind taste test, Wapo's La Choza.
Waffle-based.
Yeah, well, La Chosa won't do it.
It's Vietnamese.
So we just sidetracked ourselves on lunch, but.
That is never a sidetrack. That's important.
Yeah, it's just number one.
Sandwich.
But John, I wanted to get back to what you were trying to suggest.
Yeah, and this may fit in under number 7, and that is some follow-up on how things have gone with projects that had some unique character, some unique condition associated with them. And I'm thinking of 2. One is the top of the Daily Camera building, the public space up there. And the other is the Vectra, or the building on 13th and Walnut with the basement public space. And just to do some follow-up and see how things have gone there, because, that was the result of a lot of angst with both of those.
Was it Winslow building?
Yeah, the lower level
Winslow
retail.
building, yeah.
And another example of something that hasn't probably happened yet is the food truck thing we talked about on the Newsom development up at like 3rd. Remember the Silver
It's
Channel?
not built yet. I mean,
It's not built yet, but that would be an
food
example
trucks
of
until they
something
build
that we've, to hear about later.
Anyway,
I like
just-
that idea. That's cool, John.
I mean, Chris, can you roll that into your,
Your stuff.
Yep.
cool.
We can do that.
So other ideas? And also there's a question of like, does anybody want to do a tour around Holiday neighborhood?
I've got a surprise tour that's adjacent to Holiday.
Okay. Other agenda?
Top off. It'll be the cap off.
Okay. So any other ideas for agenda items? Are we good? I mean, it wouldn't be bad to have a little slack in the schedule, so.
Yeah.
That's
We can
good.
talk about different dinners.
We could talk about different dinners, yeah.
Yeah.
It's good. We did it.
A wish list for Cindy.
Cindy, is everything, do you have all that stuff so you can like reformat this? You got it? Cool. Figured you were way ahead of everybody, so. Is anyone interested in, I mean, we could finish up with a walking tour around Holiday, and people could opt in if they want to, and we could walk around with beers and stuff like that, glasses of wine, or we
Got a
can do it
reception.
beforehand.
I've got a little reception nearby that I'm going to put together. It's walking tour through Holiday. So yeah.
Okay, you're gonna have to be a little less secretive about this if we're gonna plan on you. So what's the scoop?
It's a venue that's coming online that's in the neighborhood. It'll be private. It's a private venue.
Okay, so we're getting sucked into something there.
Just clear your night.
And that'll have to.
All right, so maybe we'll talk about the
publicly
walking
noticed,
tour. We'll
too.
figure it out later.
Right? If planning board all goes to your private venue.
Yeah.
Peter has a final.
Yes,
So
Sarah.
this isn't
endpoint
about
for
the
the walking
schedule,
tour.
but I'd like to join the use table review,
Community building.
and I don't know how to, what's the proper way for me to make that request?
We should probably include those conversations under the liaison ex officio members and talk about what kind of
Committee assignments.
committee
and stuff.
assignments and stuff like that we have, or task forces or things like that, so.
Great.
Oh, yeah, we need to see if anybody wants to join the use table subcommittee.
Yeah.
That was what Sarah just said she did want to.
So do we have anything right now going on besides use tables? I mean, in the
We have
past, we've
the-
had a number of,
We have that thing that we both volunteered for with Carl Geiler. That's
Oh, the code.
the code writing piece.
yeah, code amendment.
Yeah. But we don't have any of the myriad groups we were all joining during the comp plan update.
Yeah, luckily all that
Those are
stuff's
all,
fallen
it's all
off.
over. So I think it's just the 2. Does anybody have anything else besides the use table and the code update that they're on? No? That's it?
Cool.
Could I, since we talked about the use table subcommittee, I just would like to say that on Friday the 3rd at 4 to 5:30 PM, we're meeting at Galvanize. That's 2 days after the retreat. Is that okay for you?
I'll be in Boston, sorry.
Oh, no. Sorry
I think you
about
missed the thing
that.
in the agreement you signed, that you never go anywhere ever again. Sorry.
Doesn't work that way.
Actually,
Yeah, unfortunately, it
that reminds
doesn't.
me of something I should mention, I keep forgetting, that I will be out of town.
You turn on your microphone, please.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, and I kept saying I was going to tell you. I will be out of town the week of May 16. So I will have to miss that one meeting.
I have a couple announcements regarding some meetings of ours.
Okay.
Awesome. So maybe we should just bleed right into like a calendar check. So if anybody's got times they're going to be away, I mean, this is a kind of good time to let Cindy know that there's an absence to be expected. So got one.
Let's look up our calendar.
While people are looking.
Let me just put this forward to you guys. Our May 2nd meeting has been canceled.
Oh, really?
Yep. Just found out today, our May 2nd meeting has been canceled. We had no items scheduled. May 16th, we do have 3 matters scheduled. We have no public hearing scheduled as of yet. We do have 3 matters that are very large, and unfortunately, we are kicked out of here. So it's off-site, and it's going to be in the Brenton Building.
Sorry, what day is it?
Okay.
The 16th.
The 16th.
Oh, so I won't be.
It'll be in the Brenton Building.
Well, so on the May 2nd, I mean, are there not applicants who were chomping at the bit to get in front of us who could fill that night?
They are pushed themselves back. They weren't ready.
Huh.
So
What is the Brent?
I mean, I don't know who it is, but
We've been there
I
before.
didn't look at the calendar
the
yet.
Brenton Building. It's on,
9th and Napa?
it's north, it's
Hungry Toad.
Alpine.
Oh,
It's on
PCH.
Alpine.
You're Hungry Toad.
Alpine Balsam.
Oh, the one on Alpine. I know where that is.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
11th and Alpine.
It's a
9th and Alpine.
mid-block building. You would never have really like,
I cannot remember that.
yeah.
But the May 2nd were canceled. huh?
Canceled.
Okay.
Oh, because it's part of the project. I know the name from reviewing Alpine Balsam, but I don't remember having been there.
Right? It's buried in
So
there.
guys, keep it tight. Let's go. We're almost there.
Okay.
So those are my announcements.
Okay. Anything else from anybody? Or are we done?
Delete.
As soon as we move to another place, like a
Right.
second.
And then we still have the 6th and the 20th of June.
Yes, and there, we do have items on those dates. So
May 29th? May 30th.
Yep. I don't think I'm going to have to be absent.
Well,
Yeah.
There is a May 30th meeting, is that correct?
Oh, yes. Well, no,
I have it on my calendar for some reason.
tentative. I don't know what's happening yet.
Blah.
I should know on Monday or Tuesday if we still have a May 30th meeting or not.
Cool.
Because that's Alpine Balsam, right?
Correct.
Maybe,
That is
maybe
pretty
not,
building.
unless it's sold by then.
Yeah, it could be.
I, for some reason.
Can you turn on your microphone, please?
It is on, actually.
Okay. You need
I
to
have-
speak into it.
Sorry, for some reason I have a May 28th planning board meeting in my calendar. Am I just totally
It's
out
May
of my
30th.
mind?
Yeah. You out of your mind?
Oh, on
There is
the joint hearing on the,
Joint
with
hearing.
city
Yeah,
council.
May 28th is joint, but
See, I wasn't-
like I
Yeah.
said, anything regarding Alpine Balsam is up in the air right now.
And that was what the joint hearing was about.
Yes. But stay tuned. Next week, we will have answers for you.
Awesome.
I should leave it on my calendar just in case.
So please leave it on your calendar as of
Okay.
now.
So I wasn't crazy.
No.
See, I feel so much better.
Well, you might still be crazy. I don't know if that's proof.
You probably enter
Proof of the
the
negative.
doors and gonna be in jet lag. Totally.
All right, cool. Anybody else have anything to get off their chest before we walk out of here?
30th.
Yeah? Great, meeting's over.
Thank you.
Thank you.